It's always a bad sign when the chair starts the meeting late. Sorry about that, folks. I'd like to call the City Council successor agency to the Redevelopment Agency Housing Authority regular meeting to order. We are going to be led in the Pledge of Allegiance tonight by our very own Tom Davids from representing the San Carlos Garden Club. Over to you, Tom.
Of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, so next is changes to the order of the agenda. Any requests from the dais or from staff?
Staff does have a change that we would like to request of the council this evening, and that is in regards to item 8D under new business. We have a minor procedural issue that we're going to want to take a look at there, so we'd like to pull this off. That was the consideration of adopting a resolution approving the right-of-way abandonment of portions of Manzanita Lane adjacent to the properties at 243 and 301 Hillcrest Road.
Okay, do we have any sense of when we would be bringing that back? Since I know there are some folks who are here tonight to listen to that.
We'll talk about it tomorrow. No longer than a month from now. Could be the very next meeting. All right.
I tell you what, ma'am. Normally, people can address the council on any item on the agenda, but since we pulled that one off, if you'd like to comment during public comment, which is for anything at all, you can certainly do that.
Thank you so much.
Sure, not a problem. Any other changes? All right, then we have an agenda and we will move forward. The next item on our agenda is a presentation from Tom Davids about the San Carlos Garden Club. And you picked a great day for it, Tom, because it's raining
Well,
all
you need a lot of water, but you could use a little sun, and warm weather would help as well. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to tell you a bit about the Garden Club. It was formed on October 29, 1937. That's 82 years ago. That's a year close to my heart, but we live on. Oh, here we see it. All right, good. Thank you, Crystal. It was formed by 8 women who are looking for a project to join with the first annual Flora Festival in San Mateo. This goes way back, but it was a big event at that time, and it turned out to be the beginning of our club. And at that point, the 8 women got together. They planted 117 Paul Scarlet rose bushes and 14 Chinese pistachio trees along El Camino Real. And that's how it all began. The club has about 55 members. We meet the third Friday of every month for lunch at the Casa de Flores. You see the picture of the Casa on the screen. This is a beautiful old building. It was built by the St. Charles Church in 1929, and it was vacated when they moved to their new property on Tamarack. And so that was in 1956, and the Garden Club purchased the building and have enjoyed its use ever since. We used it as a clubhouse. It's also rented out on weekends for people who would like weddings or receptions or other activities, and it's a very active rental place. Over the years, we've done many things to enrich the city. We've had a number of activities that the clubs year after year have put through, and we currently, our big deal is the hanging baskets on Laurel Street. That's a project that San Carlos Together, as well as the Garden Club. There are 82 baskets that we try to keep in good shape, and we're looking forward to a spring when we'll have a little warm weather and we can improve what we have there. We also work with the Master Gardeners, and the Master Gardeners, along with our group and the city staff as well, especially Park and Rec, who take care of the watering, make sure that's working well. That's an ongoing program as well. A number of events during the year. The big one coming up is our annual plant sale, which is May 4. This is our 4th sale. They've gone very well. We're looking forward to another good turnout. We'll have a wide assortment of annuals, as well as a number of succulents that you would enjoy picking up and putting in your yard. So that's the long and short of it. Any questions that you might have, I'd be glad to do what I can to answer.
Thank you, Tom. I had 1 or 2. Does anybody have questions for Tom or comments? Well, then I'll dive right in. I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. The building was built in 1929?
1929.
That was only 3 or 4 years after the city was founded.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Wow. It must be one of the oldest buildings in San Carlos.
Yeah, it is, along with the Fred Drake building on the corner. And there's a few other old timers around town as well, but there are not many of them, but this is one.
And then my other question that I had was, you mentioned that years ago they planted pistachio trees along El Camino.
That's correct.
I love pistachios. Any of them still around?
Don't know where, I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Okay.
I think all those trees have disappeared, and the rose bushes have disappeared as well. But it was a fine time. A lot was done to raise interest in part of the Pan Pacific exhibition. This is before the city was incorporated, before this building was built. But the people in town got together and did a lot of planting. They planted the eucalyptus trees at that point along San Carlos Avenue. amongst other things. And it turned out to be quite an attractive place as people were coming up and down the peninsula going to the exhibition in San Francisco.
Well, thank you for that. It's always nice to hear not only about a current active group, but one that has roots that deep in the community.
It goes deep. It does that.
Appreciate it. Any other comments or questions for Tom? Appreciate it very
Okay.
much.
Thank you very much. We have some brochures. I'll leave them for you. Pass them.
That'd be great. Thank you. All right, so next item on the agenda is public comment. This is a section of time for public to address the council on any item that's not on the agenda. Items that are on the agenda, you will have an opportunity to provide public comment on those when we come to them. For the benefit of the handful of people who came in after the meeting started, we did, because of a logistical issue, pull off item 8D, which is the consideration of adopting a resolution approving the right-of-way abandonment of portions of Manzanita Lane. So if you were planning on making a public comment on that item, this would be a good time to do it. So if there are folks who would like to do so, please come forward. I just ask when you're done if you can fill out a card and give it to Crystal.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the council and staff. I'm Betty Pollock, my husband David Pollock, and our neighbor across Manzanita Lane, Tom Miller. The 1979 abandonment we got, okay? So we live at the foot of that property. And I think you got copies of what we would propose as an amendment. So I won't go into that, I'll just tell you why. Starting about 3 years ago, Rick and Wendy called us that they wanted to get their part of the lane abandoned. We said, great. We had them come down immediately and photocopied everything from the 1979 thing for them. So we've been working with them on this. And where I'm prefacing what our concerns are. They later, were entertaining, and fortunately, they've discarded the idea of subdividing their property and building a driveway down Manzanita Lane into the back of the property where they would cut a big flat to put in another house. We have had severe erosion problems. Putting a property in there and damaging that lane would exacerbate those erosion problems. We had to put in a 3 to 7 foot deep, 1 to 3 foot wide retaining wall across the front of our property to secure it. It's a very steep hill. It looks flat on a piece of paper. I can show you pictures of when the city abandoned in 79, almost exactly 40 years ago. The water main was exposed. We had recently bought the property, and we'd put a wooden box over it to control it. So we put in fences and a tree to control the erosion. And the reason that the city finally abandoned it to us is they didn't have the funds to fix it. They were saying that it was city property, then it wasn't city property and city property. And so we went through a 3-year property to get that solely to control erosion. We would hate to see the erosion exacerbated if a new owner, Rick and Wendy, have told us that, and we've known them for 35 years.
My apologies. One of the things I forgot to mention
There's a
before you
time
started
limit.
Of 2 minutes, but since I forgot to mention it, I'll let you keep talking for up to another 2 minutes. But please, if you move to wrap up, that'd be
so
great.
I will wrap up. They proposed, the idea that they might want to subdivide it and put a house in there. And that's what our concern is. They've said they won't do that, but they're going to sell. We're not. We've been there 44 years, and our son will probably get the property at some point in time. But we are very, very concerned if anybody should try to pave over that or put in a lot and subdivide the property, it would cause erosion problems. It would certainly decrease our property value, and it would definitely decrease our quiet enjoyment of the property. So we want to be on record that we don't oppose abandoning their part. We supported that, but we would like to see in the abandonment some restrictions that would protect the integrity and security of our property. That's why we proposed the amendment that we sent to all of you. So thank you very much. And also, we travel a lot. So if you're going to take this up in a month, we won't be here. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome, Betty. Thank you. And not mentioning the time limit earlier. If there's other people who would like to address the council, please come forward. I'd ask anybody who hasn't done so already to fill out a speaker card over in the corner and give it to Crystal.
Hi, Amy. Okay, so I'm Tom Miller. I'm on the other side of Manzanita. And I just have a question. Mr. Mulvey, you said there was some issue that, can you tell me what it was?
Be happy to have the city attorney provide an explanation for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just, we don't do abandonments too often here, and I wanted to make sure that procedurally we followed all the rules that are required under the Streets and Highways Code, and a question came up in my review, and that's the reason.
Okay, so it'll come up again in a few weeks, and hopefully your answers will be answered. And
Yes, absolutely.
okay, because I won't be here in a month either, so the timing's not very good for most of us. So, okay.
If I may, and asking both Jeff and Greg, is it possible that we could arrange to bring it back at a different time, like 6 weeks from now? I mean, I don't know if 6 weeks versus 4 weeks makes a difference.
Well, for me, after the middle of June would work.
After the middle of June.
After June 21st, after June 22nd will work.
I tell you what, if we can ask staff to just coordinate with the interested parties, including Rick, and see if there's a amenable time. I mean, I don't think, unless the council has a particular shot clock in mind, I don't think there's a problem with bringing it back when it's appropriate.
We'd be happy to have staff reach out and see if we can find a time that works for everybody. There's no particular shot clock that the city's working on here, so
Okay.
Getting all interested parties in the room would be great.
Fine, that sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Is there anybody else who would like to address the council on that or any other subject that's not an item on the agenda? Crystal, I don't have any cards, so I presume nobody filed earlier. Okay. Then we will move on to the consent calendar. Consent calendar items are approved en masse without discussion, although council members can ask to remove items from them. I would actually like to ask that we pull item 6D, just because I have a couple of comments I want to make on it, so deal with it separately. Is there any other item that people would like to pull? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
Okay. I'll move we approve City Council successor agency consent calendar items A through C and F and G. And item H. Do you want me to read all of these at once? Okay, just go right through it? Okay. Item H, adopting ordinance number 1540, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos adopting amendments to the San Carlos Municipal Code, Title 18, zoning, consisting of modifications to chapters 18.05, 18.06, 18.07, 18.09, 18.23, 18.40, and 18.41, requiring a conditional use permit for establishments selling firearms or ammunition and for shooting ranges, and for establishing a zoning map restriction, the location of such uses, and a distance requirement within the City of San Carlos. And item I, adopting ordinance number 1541, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos, adding chapter 5.13 to the San Carlos Municipal Code to adopt licensing and security requirements for retail establishments selling firearms and ammunition. And item J, adopting ordinance number 1542, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos, adding chapter 5.14 to the San Carlos Municipal Code to adopt licensing and security requirements for shooting ranges, adding chapter 8.18 to regulate the storage of firearms in residences, and amending chapter 9.24 to prohibit firearms at public gatherings.
Before we call for a second, I just want to make sure, did we include item G in the motion?
Yeah,
You did, okay.
did
Jeff's
say
shaking his head.
F and G.
So we have E, F, and G, all three?
I'm sorry, E, F, and G. Thank you.
That's fine. Is there a second?
I'll second.
There is a motion and a second. Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack is absent, and Councilmember Obert.
Yes. Before we move on to take item 6D, which will be a very brief thing, I just thought it would probably be useful for the audience if, Greg, you would explain why we had Ron exhaust his vocal cords by reading all of that text.
Well, as a procedural matter, all ordinances of the City Council require 2 readings, one to introduce and one to adopt. And in an abundance of caution, I want to make sure that it is read at least once. And so the mechanism we use is to make sure that happens is we always have you read on the second reading. So procedurally, it's for sure that we've done that. Okay. That's a legal requirement.
Thank you. So item 6D, I don't need a separate staff report for it because actually I support the item. The only reason I wanted to pull it was this is to accept and authorize the filing of the Housing Successor Agency annual report for fiscal year 2017-2018. In that report, for those of you who have read the public materials, there's mention of the fact that for one of the first times recently, we actually have some money in our housing fund, which is designed to promote affordable housing or essential housing, that we have to spend within a certain period of time by state law. And I just wanted to make the point, as I have in housing discussions in the past, that while it's great we're looking to build housing, affordable and essential housing, there are other ways of dealing with that issue as well, and I hope we won't let the money grow too much moss under its feet before we actually address that. So I just wanted to make that comment. If anybody else has a comment that they'd like to make, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just, since I pulled it, I'll move approval of accept and authorize the filing of the Housing Successor Agency annual report for fiscal year 2017-2018. Is there a second?
Second.
There is a motion and a second. Any other further discussion or comment? Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell? Yes. Councilmember Olbert?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Motion passes. Thank you. We will move on now to item 7A, public hearing, consideration of adopting a resolution setting the cannabis business tax rate at 6% of gross receipts for all commercial cannabis activities. Good evening, Rebecca.
Good evening. Rebecca Mendenhall, Administrative Services Director. Before you tonight is a consideration of a cannabis business tax setting the rate at 6%. I'm going to introduce you to Jenny Liu. She's our Senior Management Analyst, and she's going to present this item.
Good evening, Jenny.
Mayor and Council. I just want to give you a little background before we move forward. Following the passage of Prop 64, Council passed Ordinance 1525 on November 13, 2017, allowing commercial cultivation, manufacturing, and testing of cannabis in zoning areas appropriate for the described use. During the November 2018 election, the city put Measure NN on the ballot, seeking approval on establishing a cannabis business tax on any cannabis business up to 10% of gross receipt. And the ballot passed with 78% approval rate. Council now has the authority to set and impose cannabis business tax up to 10% of gross receipts. And currently, there's one application for cannabis business. It is unknown as to how much the business will bring in. Generally speaking, a $2 million gross revenue at 6% tax would generate $120,000. This money will be deposited in the city's general fund for unrestricted general revenue purposes. When considering the tax rate, staff looked at the Bay Area cities with already established rates, and the rate ranges between 2.5% and 10%. 2.5% is on the low end, and it's established by the city of Half Moon Bay for testing. And 10%, which is on the higher end, and it's established by the city of San Jose. The average rate is close to 6%. So based on the data of neighboring cities' established commercial cannabis business tax rate, staff recommends 6% to be on par with other neighboring cities. So this ends my presentation. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. Do we have any questions for Jenny or Rebecca? I had one, but I don't see any of the lights on. Now your light's on. Good. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that very succinct and brief presentation. I noticed that the city's received an application so far. Do we get inquiries very often about it now that, we've passed the what was it, Measure NN?
Yeah, Measure NN. That would probably be a better question for community development, but I believe they've had a few calls.
I'm sorry,
They have had a few calls just inquiring, yeah.
Okay, but we currently have one that.
There's one application that's in the very early stages of the process, so it may take a while to get through.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Any other questions? I had a couple. First, whatever rate we pick tonight, what are the rules, and this may be a Greg question, what are the rules governing how we can change it? Do we have to give a year's notice, 90 days notice?
No, the way the Measure NN was adopted, it's an ordinance, and you have the authority to set the rate at up to 10%, and it's by resolution, so you can change it with changing conditions as you deem necessary.
Okay. Fine. That was all the only questions I had. This is item open for public comment. Is there anybody, I don't have any cards on this, but is there anybody who would like to address the council on it? All right. If not, then I will, is there a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll move to close the public hearing.
There's a motion and a second. Crystal, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Obert?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
And Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Okay, the public hearing is closed. Would anybody like to make a motion or start a discussion?
If there's no discussion, I'll make a motion.
Go for it.
Okay. I move to adopt Resolution 2019-19, a resolution of the City Council of the City of San Carlos setting the cannabis business tax rate at 6% of gross receipts for all commercial cannabis activities.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and second. Any discussion? Hearing none. Crystal, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Obert?
Yes.
And Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Okay, motion passes. We will move on to item 8A, consideration of introducing an ordinance amending San Carlos Municipal Code Title 8, Health and Safety, adding Chapter 8.03, Regulation of Smoking in Multi-Unit Housing. And Tara, before you get started, I just want to apologize to the audience members who have children here tonight because they contacted me about moving this item up in the agenda and I forgot. But fortunately, there was only one other item ahead of it, so I don't look too bad. Tara,
Good evening,
over to you.
Council. My name is Tara Peterson. I'm the Assistant City Manager, and we have before you two different tobacco-related items this evening. The first will be smoke-free ban in multi-unit housing, and the second will be a flavored tobacco ban. And Nicole Scott, the Senior Management Analyst with the City Manager's Department, will be making these presentations.
Thank you, Tara. Good evening, Nicole.
Good evening, Council. Nicole Scott, City Manager's Office. So tonight we'll be considering introducing an ordinance regulating smoking in multi-unit housing. And with us this evening, we have members of Smoke Free San Carlos, San Mateo County Health, California Apartment Association, as well as the Sheriff's Office and City Code Enforcement. So in January, Council heard a study session discussing the issue of smoking in multi-unit housing. The study session discussed local tobacco groups and resident requests to consider this ban. and the health impacts of secondhand smoke. It also discussed the 11 jurisdictions in the county that have adopted this ordinance. And during the session, council asked staff to conduct community outreach and return with a proposed ordinance. So staff engaged the community regarding the topic through a variety of platforms. A webpage was created to provide information about the topic and inform the community of past and future meetings. A Shape San Carlos survey was launched to solicit feedback on the proposed ordinance, and a stakeholder meeting was held to discuss the issue with the affected community members. And participants of the stakeholder meeting included multi-unit housing property owners, property managers, and homeowners associations. It also included members of Smoke Free San Carlos and the San Mateo County Health and Tobacco Education Coalition. And a summary of that stakeholder meeting feedback and one-on-one conversations is included in the packet attachments. Additionally, Smoke Free San Carlos met with representatives from San Mateo County Health and the city and submitted input on ordinance enforcement, which is also included in the packet attachments. So in 2014, San Mateo County adopted a smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance, and it has the following provisions. It bans smoking in all new and existing multi-unit housing units and within 30 feet of a doorway from a multi-unit housing building. It defines multi-unit housing as 2 or more units with shared or abutting walls, floors, or ceilings. However, it does exclude accessory dwelling units. It restricts smoking in common areas except for designated smoking areas, and it requires property owners or managers to install no smoking signs on buildings. It also requires property managers to introduce new lease terms, notifying tenants of the new smoking restrictions. It prohibits intimidation or harassment of a person seeking compliance with the ordinance, and it specified a 14-month phase-in period, which at that time allowed the county to perform outreach and education to the affected tenants and property owners, and also for 1-year lease terms to expire and be renegotiated with the new required lease language. So tonight, staff's recommendation is to adopt the county's ordinance, including the 14-month phase-in period. However, we do need to address 2 changes. The first change is to the responsibility of enforcement. The county will not enforce on behalf of the city. Instead, enforcement will be the responsibility of the building official. However, the county can assist with ordinance education and outreach and serve as a first point of contact for violation complaints. So this means the county would take calls, track complaints, and make initial contact with reported violators. And then if a violator becomes excessive, the county would then contact the city so we can begin our own internal code enforcement. And then our building official is here to address any questions about enforcement practices. The second change to the ordinance is the exemption of medical cannabis. The city's ordinance would not exempt medical marijuana as the county's ordinance states. This is due to a more recent state health and safety code which overrides this exemption. So smoking cannabis, medical or not, would not be permitted in the city's ordinance. So during the study session, council asked staff to research 2 additional items. The first is the inclusion of hotels in the proposed ordinance. Statewide smoking restrictions specify that all hotel lobbies, common areas, employee-only areas, meeting rooms, and then 80% of the guest rooms must be smoke-free. And then additionally, staff contacted every hotel in town, and they are all 100% smoke-free. So we don't recommend adding this additional provision to the ordinance. The second additional item researched was a ban on smoking near building entrances. Staff looked at the rest of the county and found 4 jurisdictions with this specific smoking distance requirement in their smoking control ordinance. There are Belmont, Colma, Half Moon Bay, and Menlo Park. Their smoking restriction distances range from 20 to 25 feet from building entrances, exits, or openings, which could include windows or air vents. One thing to note is that their ordinances, they do allow someone to smoke within the 20 to 25 feet of a building if they are walking by, say on the sidewalk, which can make enforcement more difficult. So due to the complexity related to outdoor smoking enforcement and the need for additional business outreach, staff does not recommend moving forward with this additional restriction this evening. If council wishes to pursue this item, staff can conduct more targeted business outreach and perform more extensive regional research on enforcement strategies and enforceable definitions for this ordinance. An additional ordinance amendment could be brought forward in the future without delaying the multi-unit housing ordinance introduced this evening. So before I invite questions, I wanted to give Greg an opportunity to add any additional comments.
Well, there was a question that I received about how the matrix for enforcement of the ordinance. It would be new to San Carlos, and enforcement would be multi-layered. The ordinance itself has a progressive discipline component to it, so it starts out as an infraction. If you have 3 or more infractions in a year, it can become a misdemeanor criminal charge. At the beginning, though, there will be outreach in an effort to obtain compliance voluntarily as people get used to this ordinance, because we have the 14-month period that we're going to take advantage of. Then if we have a recalcitrant offender, it could move up to the misdemeanor violation, which comes to my office as a city attorney. I would be enforcing a misdemeanor, which is a $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. So it's a very serious offense if we have a repeat offender that reaches up to that level. And then there's also a civil, elsewhere in the code, I'm allowed to enforce civilly if I find there's a nuisance. So those are fact specific, but if there is a nuisance and I'm able to establish it by the facts, then it's possible to get a court order restraining somebody from conducting activities that constitute a nuisance. And generally, when you violate a law, I mean, there's a provision that's a term called nuisance per se, that if you're violating the law, you're deemed to be a nuisance. So it makes it easier to enforce it, but it's still a matter of proof. But sometimes that's the most effective way to do it, because if somebody is ignoring all the other progressive enforcement mechanisms, if I get an injunction and they violate the injunction, I can just go to court and say, Judge, they're violating your injunction. And guess what happens then? The judge can find them in contempt, and the judge has much less limitations on their ability. I mean, that could be jail until they comply. That could be additional sanctions, because judges typically do not like people violating their orders. So that's the progression in general, how we would enforce the code. So if you have any questions of me on how that would work, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Greg. Questions for staff? I don't see any lights on, or perhaps there is now. Laura.
So just to kind of talk a little bit about, or questions around this, the ban on smoking near public or building entrances. So what I'm hearing you say is that the staff is not recommending that we move forward with this at that time, but I would like to just better understand kind of the concerns around why not, and if you could help me understand that, that would be helpful.
It looks like you're directing that at me. Thank you, Council Member Palmer-Lohan. Staff discussed how we would approach this issue when it was brought up, and I had some concerns about definitions of entrances to buildings, because the universe of entrances and buildings can be pretty broad in some of these ordinances, as you heard from Nicole. And we have a lot of residences and multifamily housing projects that have multiple entrances. And some of them are right next to sidewalks, some of them are not. So the ones that are on the sidewalks, it seemed could create an enforcement issue, because for a police officer or a peace officer to enforce, they have to see them violating, and the defense in that case could be somebody misleading the officer about what they were actually doing at the time. Were they just standing there smoking near the doorway, or were they walking by, for example? So I wanted to figure out if enforcement strategies that we could employ for that type of a regulation. The other issue is I put my notes here. I want to not forget the other point I wanted to make. The other point was, I think I touched on this, but the definitions of what the entrance is, I think I want to be really clear on that, because if we're going to ask our staff to enforce it, we want them to really have the ability to easily figure that out. And I'll just give you a simple hypothetical. If we have a building with multiple entrances or openings, the measurement becomes important in that case. And I was thinking practically, how is this going to actually work? And I wanted to make sure, hey, I want to give the direction to our code enforcement people. This is how you're going to measure it. This is how you're going to figure it out. And I just didn't think, I didn't want to delay bringing this forward for you tonight, because it was something that was in our agenda. But if we can continue to study that and bring that back quickly for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big, long delay, but it just wasn't ready for your consideration tonight, in my opinion.
Ron.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Nicole. Just a couple of clarifying items. The fines that are here, first time $100, second time $200, that's just all conforms with what the county has. I mean, are those county fines, Greg?
Yeah, they are. That's right out of the county ordinance.
Right. Are you aware of any instances where people have been, fined, or they've sort of proceeded through the steps, and has anything ever gotten any more serious than a third time? Are you aware of that?
I heard that. I've heard that in some of our neighboring cities, like Belmont, which was one of the first cities to enact an ordinance, they've had a fairly good success with voluntary compliance. But I don't really know the specific answer to your question about have they had to really go to the $500 level or the misdemeanor level. We could find that out for you.
From my research talking to the other cities, I don't believe there have been many instances going past the second phase of fines. Mm-hmm. Usually after the first citation, they respond.
Yeah, it just logically, it seems that as more and more cities adopt these, that hopefully the incidences would become, fewer and fewer. I don't know that for sure, but it's just it's a theory. All right, thank you.
Always the optimist. Sarah.
Thank you. I just had a clarifying question for Greg. Sorry, Nicole. So when you were talking about distance from building entrances, you're specifically referencing multifamily housing, not building entrances anywhere else, like private businesses.
Well, the ordinance, it's multifamily ordinance, but I think the ordinance has some regulation elsewhere too. It is businesses too, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
So in the proposed ordinance tonight, there is a restriction on smoking near multi-unit housing buildings. It's the 30-foot distance. That's what the county has in their model ordinance. This additional item for smoking near buildings would refer to commercial business.
So two separate items.
Yes.
The 30-foot distance from entrances and exits from multifamily housing, that's in there.
Yes.
Yes.
And you're comfortable with the 30 feet, Greg, and the measuring?
Well, I may have misspoken there, but I thought I maybe misinterpreted my conversation with staff earlier. But the commercial businesses, we did talk about the multiple front and rear entrances on commercial businesses. That was part of what we were discussing. And with residential multi-unit properties, I think the decision maybe it was made that the entrances there were limited enough because a lot of the buildings have one main entrance, but they do have other entrances, but usually that's manageable. I think that was the decision we made.
Okay, so the 30 feet is in the current ordinance that we would be voting on tonight. Okay, great, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Tara. Public comment. Anybody wishing to speak on this item, and I have a number of cards here we'll get through, but if you haven't submitted a card, please feel free to do so. Give it to Crystal. The first person I want to actually indicated they wanted to speak on agenda item 8. And of course, we have 8A and 8B here. So, and I'm going to probably mispronounce your name. Elijah Valencia? Elena. Okay. Did you want to speak on 8A or 8B or both? Well, you can certainly do that. So why don't you come forward?
Good evening. My name is Elena Valencia, and I would like to say thank you for passing the law. And that will be all.
Thank you, Elena. That was very well done. Sorry I mispronounced your name. Okay. I'm going to mention 2 names at a time so the second person can be prepared to come up. Next speaking is Gretchen Leff, followed by Randy Young.
Thank you, Council. I'm actually going to talk about the distance issue that you brought up, Sarah. I know at the last council meeting I was at, there was discussion, how do we pick a number, is 30 feet or 100 feet? So I'd like to speak to that. I did a little research and found that actually in 2012, the American Non-Smokers' Right Foundation assisted with setting a standard for safe distance for secondhand smoke before any commercial building entrance, and they came up with 15 to 25 feet, which actually this building is 20 feet, I noticed. But then in 2014, a research study, which I think you guys may have copies of, they did in the Nicotine and Tobacco Research Journal. They concluded that 9 meters, which is about 29.5 feet, was the minimum distance from a smoking source to prevent outdoor tobacco smoke. So I believe this is probably the article that a lot of the county ordinances came up with 30 feet, and most of the cities that I looked at were 30 feet, except for Palo Alto is actually 40 feet. Redwood City is about 25 feet. In this study, though, they tested the levels of the particulate matter coming from a single cigarette on the top of on an outdoor rooftop, and they tracked it over 5 days, and that's how they came up with the 30 feet. And they cited that one of the limitations, though, was that it was not tested between buildings, such as multi-unit housing, where the air wouldn't be so free-flowing. Potentially, it could be trapped. The air could be trapped between the building. So a few of us from Smoke Free San Carlos did our own little experiment over the weekend. We found that between the 3 assessors, secondhand smoke was perceptible at 30 feet away from one cigarette that was lit. And so we each progressively moved back, and the secondhand smoke was detectable up to about 43 to 50 feet. Regardless of the wind direction. And then we went between 2 buildings and lit 2 cigarettes, and secondhand smoke was detectable up to 100 feet.
Gretchen, if you could move towards wrapping up, I'd appreciate it.
That was it. So therefore, we are asking for consideration of a buffer zone of 75 feet, which is basically we took the average from 50 to 100 feet. And also in your decision to set up designated smoking areas, please consider that the particulate matter concentration was higher with more cigarettes and more smokers. So if you're going to designate smoking areas, the concentration is going to be much higher.
Thank you, Gretchen. Next up is Randy Young, followed by Edward Schlesinger. And for everybody's benefit, let me remind folks that in addition to the 2-minute time limit, there's actually some colored lights up there that'll start flashing. I think it flashes yellow when you're 30 seconds up, or up, and it starts flashing red 15 seconds off. So, Randy, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening. So I'm Randy Wong from Breathe, California, and the San Mateo County Tobacco Education Coalition. And we just wanted to thank the council for considering and to thank the city staff for developing an ordinance that we think is very strong and comprehensive to be able to protect the health of people who are living in multi-unit housing. And very glad that it covers all types of smoke to be able to provide kind of broad, comprehensive protections for folks. I will say, we do think that, 30 feet, it does seem to be the minimum that, a lot of cities have done. we would be supportive of, something that would either stay at 30 feet or that would, provide stronger protections like some other cities have also done. And then, of course, that's up to the discretion of the council. So with that, just thank you very much for moving this ordinance forward.
Thank you, Randy. Next up is Edward Schlesinger, followed by Gail Goss.
Good evening, Council. My name is Edward Schlesinger, and I'm a member of Smoke Free San Carlos. And first, we want to thank the City Council and staff for preparing this ordinance. And we have just an additional requested changes in addition to going to 75 feet and removing designated smoking areas, which we consider a potential health risk. We are also requesting that the effective date for existing units be made January 1st, 2020. And the reason being is our position is that a phase-in period of 9 months is sufficient time for someone to adjust their behavior and become accommodated to the new rules. And it also sets a very clear start date. And then also we have a clarifying question which I'd like to present to staff or Mr. Rubens, I'm not sure exactly. But in the example that you see on the picture above you, we'd like to clarify that after the passing of this ordinance, but before any kind of phase-in period ends, if a person were to smoke inside the unit and the smoke goes into the common area of the multi-unit building, as you see in the picture demonstrated, would this be considered a violation? And if so, can the enforcement process happen immediately? Thank you.
Greg, did you want to respond to that?
Well, I think that's within the discretion of the council, whether you want to have certain elements of the code take effect immediately as opposed to a phase-in. I think the reason for the phase-in, as Nicole stated, was to address the leases that people may have signed that in a building that is currently a smoking building, to recognize that they may have had an expectation in that building and give time for the mandatory lease provisions to take effect. But it is within your discretion. It's just a matter of the way the program has worked with the county being involved with education on this. There, just practically speaking, there is some time that we need to make sure the public knows. Now there is a flexibility in that time. It doesn't have to be the 14 months that's recommended. You can pick a different amount of time for the adjustment. But and if you decided that you wanted to, at the earliest point, address the hypothetical situation that the resident has displayed for you here, the earliest possible time you could have some code enforcement take place would be 30 days from your adoption. That's the earliest time. So we're talking towards May would be the earliest.
Greg, what about the second question, which had to do with the picture? The picture.
That picture, the distance requirement, I think that's what I'm reading in the picture. If I'm,
I think it was and Mr. Schlesinger can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the question was if a resident is inside their unit smoking, and the smoke gets out and goes down there, is that a violation of the ordinance as written?
During that's why I was getting the timing wrong. So during this implementation period, I think it would not be. But if once the implementation period ends, it certainly would be a violation, because it would be, you're not allowed to smoke in a building.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Gail Goss. I'm probably mispronouncing your name. Okay, thank you. And followed by Rovi Antonio.
Okay, I prepared my remarks based on the original reading of the ordinance when the medical marijuana was allowed. So most of what I have written here, I guess I don't need to mention. But it might be advisable to put into the ordinance specific language stating that individual multi-unit housing complexes can adopt rules that are more strict than what the council adopts just in case the council chooses to exempt certain products from the purview of the ordinance. And I have another reason for feeling that the designated smoking area be left out of the ordinance, because some smokers will interpret that to mean that there should be one. And in many cases, or in most cases, I understand there is no designated smoking areas. And I think it could be a cause for confusion and arguments. So I guess that's all I have to say. I lived in San Carlos for 18 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Next up is Rovi Antonio.
Good evening, Chair Olvert. My name is Rovilyn Antonio, and I'm the VP of Public Affairs for the California Apartment Association Tri-County Division. We are an organization that represents rental property owners and operators. We do have lots of membership here in San Carlos. I wanted just to say thank you again for providing us the opportunity to speak tonight. I wanted to start off with thanking staff for keeping us informed and updated every step of the way. You would be proud of the work that your staff has done on this topic. They reached out to me almost a year ago. So, to let me know that the city could be exploring this topic. And they've kept me updated every step of the way, for every meeting, community meetings. And so I think your staff has definitely done a great job of including everybody involved. Wanted to again reiterate that the California Apartment Association agrees with the city and shares your goal of protecting residents from secondhand smoke. We do not oppose the ordinance that's before you this evening. We feel that it has met the needs of a lot of the property owners. A lot of the provisions there I've spoken with staff about, and they've addressed all of our concerns. One thing regarding the phase-in period that the emphasis of at least a minimum of 12 months is that once a tenant and a landlord signs a lease agreement for some of these communities that currently have a smoking policy, you cannot change the lease. And so a phase-in period honestly allows just for that for the existing leases to phase out, and also to allow for property owners and operators to amend house rules and notify all the residents about the new rules that's coming in effective when the ordinance goes into effect. Aside from that, the designated smoking areas, I would say that is also to help protect some of those residents who currently smoke, because you are trying to change the behavior. You're not trying to evict the residents. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rovi. Is there anybody else who wishes to address the council on item 8A? Okay, thank you. Seeing none, it's up to the dais. Discussion, comments. It's open mic. You don't have to go through the lights. So whoever wants to start, just start.
I have a question.
Sure.
This is, I guess, a question for staff. Could you walk me through the designated smoking area policy, and is it required? Is it optional? Is there a distance requirement?
I don't believe that it's required. There is a distance requirement. It's the same 30 feet smoking from any doorway or opening, so that would include a window. Yeah, it is optional to have the designated smoking area.
Do we have to include that?
No, this is a policy, decision on your part. I think my assumption on the reason the county included this in is because there might be larger projects that can accommodate something like this, whereas some projects, maybe the more typical project that we have in San Carlos, although not all of them, probably are not large enough to accommodate this 30-foot or even a larger buffer zone. So I think that's probably why it's there, that there are large projects that can accommodate that, but it's a policy decision on your part whether you want to include it at all.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, just to jump in a little bit, what was the sort of concern or thought you had about you were trying to, because I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, well, somehow I missed that in the packet about the designated smoking area, and it seems to be brought up several times here tonight, and I'm just wondering if including it makes it seem like it's mandatory for a property owner to have that. I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts as well, since it was raised several times by members of the public tonight.
No, thank you. It helps. Sometimes I like to understand the context of the question.
Thank you.
So, I noticed that there were other lights on there, so just leap in.
Nicole, maybe you're the one to answer this. I didn't read anything, unless I just missed it, about signage. I mean, if we put this in place, what do landlords do? Do they put up large signs around the property that display what the smoking policy is?
It's the universal no smoking sign. They're required to put it on all of the buildings. It's not required inside each unit, but on all of the buildings and common areas, anywhere where smoking is not allowed.
Okay, thank you. And then this is probably for Greg. Somebody brought up the idea of individual buildings adopting rules that are stricter than the ordinance. Is that acceptable or legal?
It would be possible the way this ordinance is worded. This is the rules of, this is what the city is going to enforce. So if private property owners want to impose, or through a lease want to impose a different rules that are stricter than this, they can. But they can't be less strict than this.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So I appreciate the staff working on pulling this together. It's very comprehensive, and also the public coming to the fore to share their concerns. With respect to a couple issues, and I don't know on this first one where we would tackle this, but I had thought that we had talked about including something around commercial buildings, so private businesses downtown and that type of thing. I've heard from a small business owner, for example, who has a employee and students, more importantly, that are music students, and some of them with breathing issues, asthma, and that type of thing. And so, and they're next to an establishment where there's a lot of people who come out and smoke during the day. And when I read the staff report, my takeaway from one of the items here with respect to distance from doors was that staff is not recommending at this time that we would include that in here, but I would like that to be considered. Our schools have a provision where smoking is not allowed on campus, and one of the reasons why we're looking to adopt the multi-unit housing is because it impacts people who are not consenting to be exposed to smoke, as well as to children. And we have a lot of businesses in San Carlos that accommodate children, and so I'm just wondering if kind of where that would fit within this. So that's one area of concern and wonder.
Can I sort of as a bit of a riff off of that, Greg, can you refresh my memory or our memories on what are the state rules, if any, governing smoking in business establishments?
Well, it's, and staff can correct me, but you can't, smoking's not allowed in business establishments, which is why it drives it outside, why people smoke outside. It's been identified, obviously, as a health risk inside enclosed spaces. We have an ordinance that already bans smoking inside offices and businesses where the public is invited. So the business, that particular, some businesses have tried to get around that, let's put it this way, because there used to be and I think this may have been changed, but there was an owner exemption to businesses where all the workers there were owners of the business. They could still have a smoking establishment. I think those rules have been changed. We have some strict limitations on where only I think this applied to one of our businesses where it has to be a private club. It can't be accessible to the public, in other words. You can have a smoking club, but it can't it has to be separated, and the general public can't go in there. So there's a lot of robust regulation around that. What I was trying to discuss earlier was how do we create a uniform, one of the issues was how do we create a uniform system that deals with the differences in orientations of buildings and entrances and exits. And some buildings may have a side entrance, some buildings might have doors that are right next to each other. And that's what I was trying to say, that we want to make sure we study all the circumstances so we could have an enforceable ordinance. But it is something within your purview to regulate the distance requirement. It's just we want to make sure that we do it right and in a way that we can enforce.
Thank you. I was confused when you were asking the question. So, Laura, I think you're raising the issue probably about like the specific example in San Carlos is Clock Tower Music and the Orchid Room.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the Orchid Room is a bar, and Clock Tower Music is immediately adjacent to it. And Greg, as you were talking there, I do remember reading about how the bar owners had gotten a provision at one point put in state law that it allowed the exemption exactly on what you talked about. If, based on what you said about how that you believe the state has changed that law, this sounds almost like an enforcement issue. In other words, if there's still a lot of smoke coming out of the Orchid Room going into Clock Tower Music, then it's an enforcement issue.
Yeah, that's something we can look into, but for tonight I didn't study what the issues were. I just heard that that was one of the areas where there was some concern.
And just as a, I mean, I certainly understand the concern. Anecdotally, I don't tend to see people, in that particular case, just to use this as an example, I don't tend to see people smoking outside of the Orchid Room.
How often do you go to the Orchid Room, Mark?
I am almost always across the street from the Orchid Room in the afternoon, and because pizza is so popular, I often have to take my coffee across the street to the bench there. So I'm reasonably familiar with the outside of the Orchid Room, and actually my daughter used to like to go there a lot. So anyway, I want to make sure I understand the nature of the problem, whether it's an enforcement issue or whether it's that we have lots of people hanging out outside smoking.
Well, my understanding is that there wasn't any ordinance that was enforceable with respect to this particular issue. So that's why I wanted to raise it.
Right.
But it sounds like there is. So it sounds like we have. So if there was a concern by the business owner of Clock Tower Music, they could bring that up, right?
I think I'm hearing two issues. One is there presently a violation going on at a business where smoking is not allowed? And then two, is there anything we can, what I was talking about earlier is there some regulatory ordinance that we can impose uniformly across the city that is enforceable? So that's that one we're studying, and I can report back to you on whether there's any potential violation of state law or local law with regard to that business.
Could I build on Laura's? Sorry, Ron, I know you have a question, but I want to build on Laura's comment here. And that's the distance from doorways. So just so I'm understanding too, it was my understanding that staff was looking for direction tonight on whether or not to look into an ordinance where we would have a distance from doorways from building entrances and exits. And I just want to agree with Laura that that's something that I personally would like to see explored as well. I understand Laura's concerns for sure about businesses catering to children. I also think that our city has done a lot of work kind of transforming Laurel Street into an outdoor dining area. And I'm actually kind of shocked that people dining outside haven't had the experience of secondhand smoke drifting into their dinner time meal with their children or their families. And the fact that it appears to me that we don't currently have anything on the books regulating that when the chart shows, that several other cities on the peninsula have it. Foster City is another one, I don't see it on this chart, that have regulations governing the distance requirement and that also specifically mention outdoor dining facilities. So since that's kind of the way that our town seems to be going with our downtown area, I'd like to see that explored. I don't know if there's interest among my colleagues as well.
I think in the outdoor dining area, that's part of where the business is operating, it's illegal to smoke in those areas. But somebody walking by or in an area where there's an alcove nearby, I think that's the issue that a distance ordinance might help address.
So Greg, in a separate item later in the agenda packet, we talk about sidewalk vending, and what kind of got me thinking about this was that there's about a dozen or so definitions in there of distance from certain locations where a sidewalk vendor could or could not practice their business. So maybe we could take some inspiration from that. And I think, to what Sarah's talking about with respect to, close to restaurant establishments, especially where there's outdoor dining, as well as businesses catering to small children, maybe those would be some guidelines that we could use to consider expanding the ordinance to cover some of those areas of concern.
Yeah, there are a lot of different avenues that we can explore to bring this back. Foster City, for example, they limit smoking on sidewalks. Daly City, they just have their whole downtown corridor as a non-smoking area. So we'd be happy to look into that.
Ron, I think you...
Yeah. Well, I don't know, maybe I'm naive. Have you experienced people smoking on Laurel Street, or have you smelt it while you're sitting outside at Pierre Cherries or Town? Or
Yeah, I do think that it has been an issue. I also think it's an issue in the alleyways behind the businesses, and it floats into open windows and other businesses.
It's just to further the discussion a little bit. It's an interesting issue to me, because I'm not a smoker and never have smoked. And I like to tell people I grew up in a family in the Northeast where we used to have 6 people in our family car, and my mom and I were the only 2 people who didn't smoke. And that's a great way to learn not to like to smoke in the winter with the windows all rolled up. But what I wrestle with is what we're talking about here is balancing individual rights, individual abilities to do things that may in fact be somewhat harmful, but are still allowed by law, versus community rights, sort of other things. And we do that all the time. I mean, that's essentially what the role of government, particularly local government, is. And when Ron asked his question, the thought that came to me is I have yet to hear like restaurateurs complaining to me saying that I'm getting my customers complaining because they don't like the fact that somebody is smoking nearby. I'm not discounting the fact that there are people who are bothered by the smoke. The question, frankly, is what level of bother, the way I look at it, because this is a matter of balancing interests. It's the interest of the person who really does enjoy smoking and the interest of the person who wishes they didn't have to smell cigarette smoke. And it may be, in fact, an even bigger issue than just the Laurel Street environment. Jeff, do we, or Greg, do we allow smoking in public parks?
No, we have an ordinance where we've prohibited that.
We've prohibited that. It's an interesting question. I guess, as I said, based on the feedback I've gotten, to me, the balance point isn't yet at the point where I would want to do something that effectively bans the ability of somebody to smoke a cigarette while they're walking down Laurel Street. That just seems a little bit too far for me. But, that's what we're here to discuss.
I had another question about the whole distance requirement thing. By the way, you may have heard me coughing tonight. I'm not a smoker. I am the son of a smoker who died from lung cancer, though. The whole distance issue, I wonder about. I mean, I don't have any preconceived notion about what that distance should be. But my question is, if we had, let's say, a 75-foot distance, as I understand what Palo Alto does, I'm thinking of a situation where there's a daycare center. I think it's on Greenwood or Laurel, or excuse me, Greenwood or Howard, and it's like one unit in from Laurel, and it's across the street from a multi-family apartment building. And if we were to make the distance 75 feet, I'm sure that one of the rear windows of that apartment building is clearly less than 75 feet away from a daycare center. So my my question is, is there some precedent for it where distances, and I'm sorry, if it's in there, I didn't see it, where distance can be, or non-smoking distances can be adjusted for their proximity to, daycare centers, schools, anywhere where children are. Did I miss that?
It's not in this ordinance that you're considering right now, because this is, multifamily, and the distance requirement applied to that. But that's something I think we could study and as part of the comprehensive review you want us to look at. Is there some different regulation that could be recommended that deals with sensitive uses or nearby uses that happen to be within whatever your range is, that have a legal right to be there, but they're near another use where we're trying to protect the other property owner or resident.
I think there's a second daycare center down Laurel Street down in White Oaks. It's right across the street from, I think, a multifamily unit. So I just wonder, is that something that there's interest in maybe sort of fine-tuning this distance requirement?
Let me check in with my colleagues here. I think we've got a couple of things. We've got one thing in front of us, and we've got several ways that we can go forward. There is a particular ordinance here that we could act on if we so chose to do so tonight, with some minor amendments to it. It's not that we can't make major amendments, it's just that when we make major amendments, we really need to take time to have staff go back and make sure that they're properly structured. But small things like tweaking a distance number, that's a relatively simple thing to do. I think there's been interest expressed in studying in having staff do the work that Greg was referring to several times about going out and doing a more substantive review of the, I'll call it the business-oriented side of this. And again, we could defer acting on what's before us tonight until that work's done. We could act on this and then have staff come back and bring back the additional work that Greg's referring to, which could then in turn turn into yet another ordinance or an amendment of this existing one, right? I mean, it's not like we're stuck with not being able to come back and talk about it.
No, you'd still couldn't come back with new regulations.
So the question I guess I'm seeing is, I think there's general consensus that we would like staff to do that next level of work. My comments notwithstanding, I mean, the two of you indicated you wanted it. I think I heard Ron say that he was interested in seeing it. So I think there's a general agreement about that. So Jeff, that's direction for staff on that. Which leaves us, I think, with the notion of what if anything, do we wish to do about the specific ordinance that's in front of us tonight?
Well, I would say that if we have alignment, that we can continue to pursue study of impact on smoking in commercial areas and sensitive areas, that we move forward with that, but then further discuss the ordinances that are on the table tonight with respect to multifamily home dwellings.
I agree, yeah.
In that regard, is there anybody who would like to make an motion, either as written or with an amendment in it? As you said, you can make as big an amendment as you want. It's just at some point, Greg's going to get nervous that he's going to need time to make sure that we didn't mess something up.
I think there was a couple of issues I heard about with respect to the current ordinances. One was the effective date, the phase-in periods, as well as the smoking area were two areas and the distance from. So what I would suggest is if it would be possible for us to consider two phase-in periods, one for buildings where there were already non-smoking in place, so that would be a shorter phase-in period, and for those buildings that were currently smoking, designated smoking, right, that give a longer lead time to address the concerns that Roby from CAA brought up around any kind of contractual changes that need to be made, et cetera. So I don't know if it's possible to do two different effective dates depending upon the current situation.
Jeff, any comments on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, and the only thing that comes to mind is that then we're going to have two different even though there is a distinction that you brought up, we're going to be enforcing the law differently for different people where they're situated. So that causes me a little concern, but I haven't really researched that and whether we can do something like that. But that's what the issue that I see tonight.
You know, just to my own perspective is, I personally would be more comfortable. I'm actually okay with the 14-month thing, but I would personally be more comfortable if we wanted to adapt part of what you're talking about by accelerating that and having an earlier adoption, but just one adoption. Just okay, it goes into effect whenever, 9 months, certain date, whatever. Because I think that's a lot easier to disclose, get out there, educate people on, and actually have staff manage.
I think there's a sort of an enforcement issue. You add an element of confusion. I don't mind making it shorter, but I'm a little uncomfortable with having dual phase-in periods or multi-phase-in periods.
Since Laura was kind enough to sort of summarize some, if not all, of the issues that are sort of seriously floating out there. Maybe we can do this in a step-by-step fashion. I just indicated that I'm fine with the 14-month proposal, but I'm also amenable to something else. What would other people like? Let's see if we can achieve consensus on that, and that'll help guide making a motion.
I appreciate Rovi's comments, and if that's true, I don't see how we could make it less than the 14 months. If you sign a year lease and someone has just signed a lease in the last month, and then there's no way that we could change that. That's kind of my understanding.
And that's kind of was the basis of me saying that's where I was leaning to. But what Ron and Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. It would really be nice to have a shorter phase in, but that's when it meets reality, and you've got signed leases and. Now what do you do? So I want something that's realistic and enforceable.
You okay?
Yeah,
all
that's
right. And this will sound a little facetious, but remember, even though we are coming late to this party, we are moving in the right direction. So it will happen eventually. And one of the things that I always remind myself about is unless a future council changes it, it's not going back. So that's a good thing. You also indicated there was some discussion about the issue of distance.
Yeah, well, I heard Sarah express some concern about making sure that the ordinance didn't make it appear that it's mandatory to have a smoking area, and I would agree with that just because of Greg talked about the fact that so many of the buildings are small, right, and a designated smoking area may not really be feasible. So to what extent the language could be clarified to make it clear that that's a option, right?
May I ask, sorry to interrupt you. I have a question for Rovi, actually. Yeah, sorry. One more question, since we have the resident expert here. I'm just wondering how many of your apartment owners actually have a designated smoking area? Do you know, is it a small percentage, large percentage? How common is it to offer that amenity to your renters?
A small number. Here's the reason why. I would say about 80% probably of all of our membership already have a smoke-free housing to begin with. And if you're talking about in San Carlos, that number is even smaller just because the type of buildings that you have in San Carlos, you don't necessarily have larger garden style where there is that designated smoking area. So the way that I interpreted the ordinance as written is that it's not mandatory for owners to have a designated smoking area, but if they choose to, it gives them the parameters of what they can do. And we support the language like that.
Craig, if I can follow up on that, if the motion were to include an amendment that we wanted the designated smoking area to not be mandatory, is that sufficient guidance to actually enact it, or is that something that you need to go back and redraft it?
No, I think we could. I mean, it says. I mean, I'll just read the actual effective statement. It says basically it says the landlord may designate a portion of the common area as a designated smoking area, so they don't have to because it uses the word may. in the current
okay.
language.
I missed that.
And then as the resident said, there's criteria that if you're going to have one, if you're going to try to have one, it has to meet 5 criteria that are specified in the.
You are not required to have one.
You're not required to have one.
And presumably, if you can't meet the criteria, you probably will opt not to have one.
You cannot have one if you can't meet the criteria.
So it sounds like it actually already is optional. Okay, good. Well, that's good. That's good discussion. Then we also had some discussion specifically about not the designated smoking area, but the distance parameter itself. What's in the draft ordinance is 30 feet, correct, Greg?
That's right.
And what's the dais think about that?
Well, I go back to what I said before. I think that 30 feet is more or less a county average. Is that right?
It's what the county model ordinance is built on.
But I really think that we ought to take a look at multifamily residences that are within a certain number of feet, and we'll use 75 just for discussion purposes, of places where children are being cared for. I mean, and I don't want to say just a mom taking care of her kids, but a daycare facility. I would, because I can think of at least 2 instances, and there may be more. In fact, I just thought of a third. Laurel and Holly. There's a daycare facility there. All of those are within they're within about 75 feet of a multifamily unit, mostly apartment buildings.
Let me follow up because I thought I understood what you were talking about before, and after you explained it again, I'm a little bit confused. So I'm visualizing a multifamily housing unit system that's within a certain, and it's a certain distance away from a child care center, just to pick one as an example. So the ordinance says that the multifamily housing structure, if the landlord wants to, that's the optional thing, they can create and define a designated smoking area, okay? Your concern is that if they say, oh, I want to do that, and I can meet the other requirements, but they put the designated smoking area, say, 50 feet away from the child care center, that's what's concerning you.
Well, it's not the designated smoking area. It's that we have said that there shouldn't be smoking within 30 feet of the building, unless I'm misinterpreting it that as the 30 feet is now the designated smoking area. Is that what they're saying?
It's the operable doorways and entrances of the multifamily.
Okay, you're right. So I said designated smoking area, but basically the 30-foot rule puts sort of a boundary around the entrances, and we're basically saying the residents of that facility need to be outside of that boundary, and you're saying, but what if that puts them really close to a child care center?
Yeah, what if a child care center is 38 feet away or 40 feet away or something like that?
Okay.
That's my question.
Mr. Chair, one of the issues in the designated smoking area, the 5th one, is the designated smoking area has to be at least 30 feet from unenclosed areas primarily used by children and unenclosed areas with improvements that facilitate physical activity, including playgrounds, swimming pools, and school campuses. So there is a protection for the first issue you talked about, that if you want to have a smoking area, you can't just push it up against an adjacent property owner who's a sensitive use. And then the second issue is, I understand what Councilmember Collins is saying, but I think that's part of the comprehensive review as opposed to regulating multi-unit housings.
I was going to ask that. So basically, I mean, it takes 2 to tangle. So you could either put the rule in on the housing side, or you could put it in on the business side. And what you were saying, Ron, is I'm not sure I'm comfortable adopting a housing rule that has this negative impact on a child care type business. And another way of dealing with that, since we've already said to staff we want you to bring back a comprehensive review of the business side, is to include it in that and say, let's study it then, and if we decide to adopt it or that part of it or that and other stuff, then we do it then.
If that accomplishes pretty much the same thing, I'm fine with it.
Okay, that's fine. And Greg, that will be, I know you've said it several times, but that kind of thing will be part of the comprehensive review.
Right.
Okay, good. All right. So then I think what we have is again, just specifically within the confines of the ordinance as drafted based on the county's model ordinance is 30 feet what we want to do in San Carlos for as defined as how the 30 feet is used. There was some discussion about that amongst citizen feedback and I think on the dais itself. So are people okay with the 30 feet? Do you want to go beyond 30 feet? If so, what number do you want?
Well, I mean, just given kind of the close proximity of these buildings, I'm thinking that 30 feet would probably be adequate, right? Because it would, you step outside to have a cigarette and you're 30 feet from another multi-unit building, you can't smoke there either, right? It kind of forces you to have to
be 30 feet away from everything.
Correct.
All the multifamily stuff, yeah. Yeah, that's kind of my feeling too.
I think it gets harder to enforce when you get
bigger,
more than 30 feet.
You okay with that?
Yep.
All right, so, let's see, just to summarize, I think we've asked staff to do the in-depth review that Greg has referred. We're going to call it the Greg Rubens in-depth smoking review from now on. And I think everything else, we were okay with this as written. Is that correct?
I think there were two other issues just to bring it back to the beginning. One was eliminating the exception for medical marijuana that's in the currently written ordinance in front of you. And then we have another kind of cleanup issue about enforcement, that the enforcement is going to be by the chief building official or his or her designee as opposed to the chief of the San Mateo County Health System. We thought that in this draft it was some confusion about whether they were going to enforce this particular chapter since it's modeled after theirs, but they're not, so it has to be a city official.
Okay, the first item you mentioned about the medical marijuana, unless I misheard, I thought staff said that the state had revised its rules and basically it trumps what's in the county ordinance. So, right. I mean, we could adopt what the county has, but it would mean nothing because the state's already said.
That's true, but yeah, we're just recognizing that when the county, now you do not have to allow an exception for medical marijuana anymore, and we had an exception for it. So you could eliminate that section, and if you passed it, it wouldn't be enforceable anyway, but it doesn't make sense to have it in there anymore.
Okay, so I misunderstood. I thought the draft ordinance that was in front of us did not have that exception in it. You're saying it actually does.
It does have the exception, and
okay.
we want to take that out.
And refresh the second thing you said again was?
Well, we have the
enforcement side.
The enforcement side, who enforces the ordinance? The first steps of enforcement are going to be outreach by the county health department, but we inadvertently put the language in here that says they're going to enforce the code, and we want to change that to the chief building official or her or his designee.
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize. I think what staff is recommending, and it's up to the council to decide whether it accepts this or not, is that we move approval of the ordinance subject to dropping the exemption for medical cannabis and by incorporating the language that would put the city's building officials on the front line of enforcement first with the county to back them up.
No, the county wouldn't be involved anymore in this, except as the informational at the beginning.
Right. Thank you. Having gone through all that, is there anybody who'd like to make a motion? And feel free to make any kind of motion you like, just hopefully on this subject.
And this is introducing the ordinance tonight, so.
Yes.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. I move to introduce ordinance number
1543.
1543, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos amending San Carlos Municipal Code, Title 8, Health and Safety, adding Chapter 8.03, Regulation of Smoking in Multi-Unit Housing. Can I say with the two amendments as mentioned? Or do I need to spell them out?
Well, the two amendments are to eliminate, just to be clear, to eliminate Section 8.03.080, medical marijuana, and to change section 8.03090D to say the enforcement of this chapter shall be the responsibility of the chief building official of the city of San Carlos or her or his designee.
Is that acceptable?
That's perfect. Thanks, Greg.
I'm surprised you didn't just do that yourself. That's so obvious.
And the rest of that last one is the same. It's still going to have enforcement by peace officers that will be, it's still included.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
There is a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Crystal, please call the roll.
Councilmember Olbert?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
And Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Good. Motion passes. Thank you, everybody. I know that was a little bit tedious, probably boring to the audience as well, but we have to get this stuff right. And when we tweak things, we try not to tweak them in such a way that causes Greg to pull his hair out later. All right, we'll move on to item 8B. Consideration of introducing an ordinance amending San Carlos Municipal Code Title 8, Health and Safety, consisting of adding a new Chapter 8.02 to the San Carlos Municipal Code to prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products in the city limits and tobacco products in pharmacies, and modifications to Chapter 8.06 to add the definition of, quote, tobacco products, unquote. Hello again, Nicole.
Hello. Nicole Scott, City Manager's Office. So tonight, like you just said, we'll be considering introducing an ordinance to prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products within city limits and the sale of all tobacco products in registered pharmacies, and then also adding the definition of tobacco products to our municipal code. So in January, Council heard the study session discussing the issue of flavored tobacco, and staff went over the increase of flavored tobacco use among minors and the 3 jurisdictions in the county that have a flavored tobacco sale ban. They are Half Moon Bay, Portola Valley, and the county. And I'll note that Portola Valley and Half Moon Bay both adopted the county's flavored tobacco ordinance. So staff engaged with the community through a variety of platforms. The webpage was created to provide information. Shape San Carlos survey was launched to solicit feedback, and a stakeholder meeting was held to discuss the issue with affected community members. Participants included members of the San Carlos and Sequoia School District, affected tobacco retailers, and then San Mateo County Health and the Tobacco Education Coalition. Additionally, staff had one-on-one meetings with business owners and delivered the finalized agenda packet to each affected business. And a summary of that feedback is in the agenda packet. So the county adopted the flavored tobacco ordinance in June of last year. The key provisions of their ordinance is that it prohibits the sale of any flavored tobacco product. It prohibits a pharmacy from selling any tobacco product, not just flavored, and it defines tobacco products to include e-cigarette devices and their accessories, even if they're sold separately from each other. It went into effect 30 days after adoption. However, there was a 6-month phase-in period before enforcement began, and during that time, the county met with each affected retailer and to discuss the ordinance phase-in period and help them identify the restricted inventory. So tonight, our recommendation is to adopt the county's ordinance to ban flavored tobacco sales in city limits and regular tobacco sales in registered pharmacies. So we originally expected the county to conduct enforcement on behalf of the city, but we heard this evening that the county will need to conduct an internal review process before agreeing to provide enforcement on behalf of the city. Greg can go into this in more detail. So the city's ordinance would go into effect 30 days after adoption, and it could default to the 6-month phase-in period for enforcement like the counties did. However, if desired, council can give direction tonight to specify a different phase-in period. Half Moon Bay allowed 6 months, and Portola Valley allowed 3 months, but they only had one affected retailer. So we're looking for direction tonight on the phase-in period. An additional item that staff researched was to ban the sale of tobacco products within close proximity to a school. So there aren't currently any other jurisdictions in the county with this type of restriction. And there are 2 tobacco retailers in the city that are within 1,000 feet of a school that would potentially be affected. Staff met with both business owners and heard that this restriction would negatively impact their business, one saying that they would have to close their shop completely. And if council wants to pursue this item, it would require a change to our zoning ordinance, which would need to go through the Planning Commission. So we're looking for direction on that item as well tonight. And again, before I invite questions, I'll turn it over to Greg to add anything additional.
Well, I think this is the issue of the enforcement again on this one. We thought that in our conversations with the county that this particular ordinance would be enforceable by the county health official, and they advised us that that is under review. So rather than hold up this ordinance, we are suggesting an amendment to insert the city manager or his or her designee as the enforcement authority under this particular ordinance.
Sorry, all right. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Greg. Questions for staff? Actually, I had one quick one while people are collecting their notes. Nicole, what constitutes a registered pharmacy? Is that like a CVS or a Walgreens or?
I'll let Greg take this one.
Well, it's how they're registered under our business registration ordinance. So how the business is registered and the type of business they have, and we have principal uses and other uses, and we wanted to make it clear that it applied to pharmacies.
I see. It's not a particular class of pharmacy. It's a business that is doing what I would think of as being a pharmacy.
Yes.
As registered as such. Got it. Okay. So it would be things like Walgreens and CVS and whatnot.
Right.
Okay. Great. Laura.
Thank you. When it comes to the county ordinance, is that applicable to the unincorporated areas? I'm assuming, is that correct?
Yeah, that's where their ordinance applies.
Okay. All right. And then, what was my other question on this? So with respect to, for example, the close proximity to schools, you had mentioned that there's a business owner who said that they would go out of business if we applied this rule to all tobacco products within a certain distance of schools. Could you talk a little bit more about that concern, and has there been any concerns about them, selling to kids or anything like that, and kind of where is this retail location that has expressed their concern?
So the retailer is General Store, which is Tobacco Club. It's down on the 1600 block of Laurel. They're close to Redwood, the Continuation High School in Redwood City, and their main business is selling tobacco products.
We know, have they been any violations with respect to this particular establishment? Have they been good actors in this?
Not that we know of.
I'm not aware of any violations of that state law. And as you know, state law was just changed to that you have to be 21 now to buy tobacco products, which makes it harder for high school age kids who are turn 18 in their senior year from getting access to tobacco products.
Sarah.
Thank you. So council received a letter from one of our local business owners, Downtown Cigars and More, who noted that they sell premium pipe tobacco and cigars, and anyone under the age of 21 cannot go into their store. They noted that the town of Portola Valley adopted an ordinance allowing for exceptions for retailers who meet certain criteria. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about so it sounds like the town of Portola Valley had one affected retailer as well. And what did they pass that
So I looked into that, and Portola Valley, they don't have an exception for any different kind of retailers. They adopted the county's ordinance by reference.
So they don't have a special business license requirement?
No.
Thank you.
Ron.
Thank you, Mark. What constitutes flavored tobacco? I realize menthol is part of it, but when I think of my friends' parents and, grandfathers who used to have pipes, they always had some sort of aroma. What's a flavored tobacco? Is it something that goes in a pipe? Is it something that goes in a cigar? Or is it everything? Cigarettes too?
Yeah, so flavored tobacco is any kind of tobacco product that has a characterizing flavor, and a characterizing flavor is anything other than the taste or aroma of tobacco. So any kind of flavor that you've seen in a cigarette, yes, or smokeless tobacco would be flavored tobacco.
So when you talk to these two business owners, right? Did you go into their stores and you
Yes,
talk to them?
the ones near schools.
What do they sell most of? What's their biggest seller?
So one of them is the Devonshire Little Store, and he didn't sell any flavored tobacco products. He just sold cigarettes. I don't think I even saw menthol cigarettes there. So he would be affected if the ordinance also included no tobacco sales near schools, but he won't necessarily be affected by the ordinance just to ban flavored tobacco sales. The Tobacco Club or General Store, they sell a variety of things.
That's the one on South Laurel you're talking about?
Yes, that's the one on South Laurel. I would say a lot of the e-cigarettes, vaping, those kind of devices, as well as flavored small cigars and regular cigarettes.
Is he the one that said he'd go out of business?
Yes, she did.
She did, okay. And is that because, is it more the flavored tobacco, or is it more the e-cigarettes and the vaping?
She said that specifically about the additional item in the ordinance about banning the sale of tobacco near a school. So she didn't necessarily say she would go out of business just for the proposed ordinance tonight for banning flavored tobacco.
Okay. I'm embarrassed to admit that my mother used to send me to the little store with a note to buy cigarettes for her.
And how many of them did you smoke on the way home, Ron? Don't answer that.
I never did. Okay, all right. That gives a little bit more context to what their issue is. All right. So, last question: if we said, well, we'll leave. If you had said to her, the council's proposing that we just ban e-cigarettes and not flavored tobacco, do you have a sense of what her reaction might have been? I know I'm asking you to speculate, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine. I'm just sort of wondering, when she said I have to close down, what's the real issue there? Is it just selling, pipe tobacco, or is it the e-cigarettes and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say I'm not really sure. When I talked to her, I was more focusing on the issue of banning tobacco near schools because that would affect her so specifically, and her main business is selling tobacco products. But I don't have a sense of e-cigarette devices versus a regular cigarette or pipe tobacco.
Right, and she is basically a long stone's throw from Redwood High School, right?
She's within 1,000 feet.
Okay, all right. Except that to get there from one place to the other, you've got to go quite a ways.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got to go down Old County, across, down El Camino. All right. But I'm not sure we take that into consideration, correct?
No, it's as the bird flies, right?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. All right. Thanks, Nicole.
So thank you again. A couple of quick questions. One, just general education for me. I presume menthol cigarettes qualify as flavored tobacco.
Correct.
Right. And since I don't smoke, I don't tend to follow this. Am I correct in remembering that the FDA has either banned them or is talking about banning them, or?
I think I read an article, that's under discussion, but I think maybe we have some subject matter experts here.
Always good to have a subject matter expert. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, Council. Yes, you're correct. The FDA did throw out the possibility of potentially banning them at some point. However, we don't know yet when or if that'll ever come to fruition. Also, the chief of the FDA resigned, so that throws everything up in the air in terms of tobacco control and all the things that he thought were good potential policies to move forward. So it's best that local government, such as yourself, continue moving forward with tobacco control policies and ordinance, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So basically, as written, this would potentially ban a type of product that is been in use for a long time and is consumed by a number of smokers. Of course, we're talking about banning a number of things here, but let's see. There was something else I wanted to ask, and I'm not remembering what it is, so it couldn't have been too important. Any other questions at this point?
I'm sorry, I have a hypothetical question, and I don't know who can answer this, but.
As long as it's not you answering it, because then it's a rhetorical question. Okay, go.
It seems to me that there's been a lot of attention paid recently to the whole issue of e-cigarettes and vaping and that sort of thing. A staff report was pretty explicit in that, young people are encouraged to experiment with those kinds of cigarettes. I don't get the sense that young people are going in and buying pipe tobacco or cigars or old-fashioned cigarettes as much as they seem to be being steered toward these newer products. Am I right in that? Or do I have the wrong impression?
By the way, can I ask you to introduce yourself? I mean, I know your name, but just for the benefit of the public.
Good evening. My name is Craig Wingate. I'm with San Mateo County Health. And flavored tobacco products the concern about flavored tobacco products is that they are starter products for youth. Tobacco products of any type that has a flavor. So one of the reasons why the FDA banned the use of flavored cigarettes besides menthol was because they were shown to be very effective in leading to youth using cigarettes. So the concern when it comes to other flavored tobacco products such as e-cigarettes, chewing tobacco, any type of flavored tobacco product is that it will continue to, or it will lead to youth using more and more different types of tobacco products, including non-flavored tobacco products. So it's, in terms of the research, not allowing youth to have access to any flavored tobacco products it tends to be more effective.
Okay, so if we were to say, well, we're only going to ban vaping products and e-cigarettes, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You're saying it just maybe shifts it.
Yeah, the fact that there are still flavored tobacco products available, and we know that based on research, based on what we see from the tobacco industry, flavored tobacco products tend to attract youth. It's best for youth not to have access to any flavored tobacco products.
Okay, thank you.
Don't go away, because I think my question, which Ron's question prompted me to remember, is probably for you, Craig. And thank you for coming tonight and helping to educate us. In community, since we would hardly be the first community to undertake a ban of flavored tobacco products and whatnot, have there been any studies looking at the adoption rates among young people in those communities, sort of before and after the bans went into effect?
None that come to mind at this particular moment.
Because I guess it's fairly early. I mean, it's fairly recent. It's hard to do those kind of large-scale studies until a few years have passed and you have a big data set.
Yes, and unfortunately, in terms of doing a study like that, the rate of youth using flavored tobacco products has increased significantly over the last year or 2 years. So to conduct a study, we would need to do that starting now, and then as more and more jurisdictions adopt these types of ordinances, that's when we can actually do and see how effective the ordinances are.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'm going to open it up for public comment. We can obviously have questions after we do that, so that's okay. So again, for the benefit of the members of the public, I have a number of cards here. Anybody else who would like to address us, please fill out a card and give it to Crystal. As a reminder, we give speakers 2 minutes. You'll see the lights flashing when you get within 30 seconds and flashing even more when you get within 15 seconds. First up, if Elena Valencia is still here, I think she may have gone home. Yes. So first up is Bob Gordon, followed by Mindy Hill.
Good evening. My name is Bob Gordon, and I'm a member of the San Mateo County Tobacco Education Coalition, and we're working to protect young people from the devastating effects of tobacco. Specifically, I'd like to address the part of the proposal that would eliminate the sales of harmful tobacco and nicotine products in pharmacies. A pharmacy is a place to get better, not a place to get cancer. Pharmacies should no longer receive a license to sell tobacco products, no longer allowed to sell electronic smoking devices, chewing tobacco, cigarettes, little cigars. These are flavored little cigars, chicken and waffles and fruit fusion and so forth. So that's what the young people go for, unfortunately. You may or may not know, but 21 other California communities have successfully ended the sale in pharmacies of all tobacco products, starting with San Francisco in 2008. And in San Mateo County, unincorporated San Mateo, Daly City, Half Moon Bay, and Portola Valley. Now, all pharmacies would be covered. So, and I think this question came up. There are generally 4 types of licensed pharmacies licensed by the California Board of Pharmacy. And those would be independent pharmacies, chain drugstores such as Walgreens and CVS, pharmacies within grocery stores such as Lucky's, and pharmacies within big box stores, which wouldn't apply here. 3 lawsuits in San Francisco nearly 10 years ago concluded that as long as all pharmacies licensed by California Board of Pharmacy are included, the City Council may act to protect the health of the community by not allowing tobacco retailer licenses for any of those pharmacies. By the way, Lucky Supermarket and Walgreens are complying very well in Daly City and would be expected to follow suit at their locations here. So why work on such a policy in San Carlos? Well, we know that our young people frequent the local drugstores, and when they arrive at a front counter of a drugstore such as Walgreens, they often see a huge wall of tobacco products, Camel, Marlboro, all the advertising that's associated with it. So community members and their elected leaders do have the power to restrict.
Bob, could you move to wrapping up, please?
Yes, absolutely. You can change what a pharmacy looks like to young people in this community. And I have submitted some frequently asked questions sheet and a list of the 21 jurisdictions that have the law in place. Thanks very much. I'm happy to share these temporarily if these would be helpful too, to be aware of what's in our stores.
Thank you, sir. Next up, as I mentioned, is Mindy Hill, followed by Randy Wong.
Hello, thank you, council members. My name is Mindy Hill, and I'm here to advocate for this complete ban of flavored tobacco products and all tobacco products within the however long you designate with your previous ordinance. Excuse me. So as an educator for the past 26 years and currently wellness director for the San Carlos School District, I've closely monitored community health indicators as they relate to our youth over time. Specifically, the California Healthy Kids Survey indicates that, unfortunately, over the last 5 years or so, our students' perception of harm has greatly decreased. When we ask them questions about how harmful are tobacco products, how harmful is marijuana, their perception of harm has decreased significantly. And what that tells us is that students are actually at more risk of becoming addicted to these products. That, coupled with the potency of the electronic cigarettes, the vape juice, are really a recipe for disaster. And so we need to do whatever we can to reduce access to these products, to really be a community that reinstills that accurate perception of harm for our students. And I appreciate you creating this process, and I'm very hopeful in the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy. Next up is Randy Wong.
Well, good evening
again, sir.
Yes, thank you. So again, Randy Wong from Breathe, California, and the County Tobacco Education Coalition. I think this issue of flavored tobacco products in all its forms is just such a very important issue to protect youth from even starting to smoke. One of the most important things I think to remember is that the tobacco industry has tried for decades in so many different ways to try to get young people to start smoking. And flavors have been such a big part of that equation. I think, to answer in more detail some questions about menthol cigarettes, that definitely has been a product that was developed, if you look into histories of that, to try to get certain parts of our population's youth to start smoking, especially African-American youth. But that has become something that has really been a scourge to start a lot of youth of all backgrounds to start smoking, including Asian Americans, who are 6 in 10 youth smokers of regular cigarettes, use menthol cigarettes, and also majorities of Latino and white youth also. I recently talked with a woman who was in the Cordilleras Mental Hospital who had had a heart attack, and she was just about my age. And I asked her, she was a smoker, and she asked me about, I asked her about how she got smoking. And for her, it was menthol cigarettes as a teen. So really just to remember the importance of that in getting young people to smoke. Then there's the wide variety of e-cigarette liquids and flavored cigars that I think we've all talked about too. Those are equally important to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Is there anybody else who wishes to address the council on this item? If there is, please step forward and just put a card in afterwards. Okay, seeing that nobody is stepping forward, it's open mic time again, guys. If anybody wants to make a motion or ask further questions or start a discussion, have at it.
So I'm still a little confused about the pharmacy issue. So are we saying that, or does this ordinance suggest that with respect to a pharmacy, knowing that, for example, Lucky's has a pharmacy in their store, are the cigarettes located behind the counter of the pharmacy, or are they just located in the store? And so is this ordinance suggest that if we prohibit a pharmacy from selling cigarettes, that also means that they're just not available in the store, generally speaking?
Greg, that's a question for you.
Sorry, I was looking. Can you repeat the question?
I know, I was looking to catch you out there.
So. It would be. So the pharmacy issue, I'm still confused about that. So as an example, Walgreens, CVS, Lucky's, they all have a separate area that's a pharmacy. And is this ordinance suggesting that the cigarettes are available right now behind the counter of the pharmacy and they can't sell it there, but they could locate the cigarettes elsewhere in the store? Or is it that cigarettes would not be available anywhere within the box of those retailers?
I think now I understand your question. I think the issue that, as we see it, is if a business is registered as a pharmacy in our business registration ordinance, then they would be considered a pharmacy, and so everything in the building would be prohibited everywhere in the building. There's a nuance, and I think one business was mentioned of Lucky. If Lucky owns the pharmacy in the business, then I think that's one issue. But there is a potential issue that Lucky's kind of subleases out the space to a pharmacy, and a pharmacist is operating a pharmacy in there. So that's the nuance that I see. The pharmacy in that scenario could not sell cigarettes. The Lucky possibly could, but I think it's an issue of who owns the business in that scenario, because you could see you might have one building where there's multiple tenants in the building, and I think it's analogous to that.
Nicole, did you reach out to Lucky or just Walgreens?
Lucky was included in all of the outreach. They were invited to the stakeholder meeting, and I got a packet from us. They didn't provide any comment on their stance on this.
Okay. Are there other grocery stores that have the same kind of combo of pharmacy plus groceries?
I don't believe so in town.
Okay. Thank you.
I had a question for my colleagues that I'd like to try and understand a little bit. The potential additional item of putting a distance buffer, basically banning the sale of tobacco products within a certain radius of schools. And my question basically is, I want to make sure I understand what the goal. Well, I know what the goal of doing that is, but what's the thinking behind doing that? For anybody who's supporting it, and nobody supports it, then there's going to be a dead mic here. But if there are people who think that's a good idea, I'd like to understand what their thinking is. Okay, maybe no.
I'm not sure I understand exactly what it is you're asking.
Okay, you don't understand me, so that's fair. Happens all the time.
No comment.
So one of the potential items that we could include in the ordinance is this notion of saying nobody gets to sell tobacco products within X feet of a school. Okay, that's on one of the slides. Flavored tobacco ban, additional item, if there's anybody on the dais who supports that, and I'm sort of ambivalent about it, which is why I'm asking the question. If there's anybody who supports it, I'd like to hear the argument for why they support it, I guess is another way of putting it. So.
Well, that almost implies that we would allow it in places where there aren't so many feet within the school. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. If they were further away than that, then, and no, remember, this is actually all tobacco products. This would be like the example of the store that's within 1,000 feet of Redwood High School, and all of a sudden they would not be able to sell their products anymore. So,
can staff speak? Was this raised as an issue among the public? I'm a little confused on where this.
That's a really good.
It was raised by us at the retreat.
It's possible it was raised by Adam, because he's not here tonight. There's nobody stepping forward, but.
I believe it was raised by a member of the dais. I don't recall 100% who that was at the January 28th City Council meeting, study session on this. So that's where it came from.
And I'm not, we don't have to debate it. I just literally wanted to understand if there was somebody who wanted to walk me through that.
Well, I think the concern, just given the fact that we're talking about proximity to a school, right, is the fact that the spirit of this flavored smoking ban was to help make sure that youth don't have access, right, to a product that could potentially get them hooked, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if there's a retail location within, a short distance of a school, I think that was the concern. What I heard tonight was that we don't have any evidence that any of the stores that are selling tobacco are doing so in violation of the age. So in my mind, that mitigates that issue.
I see. Okay.
Right.
All right, that's fair. No, I appreciate that. Any other comments or discussion or proposals?
Yeah, I was just reading this one part. It talks about activity at the state level. It says our city has the opportunity to see how the state decides this issue before the council determines if it wants to take local action against flavored tobacco that may be in conflict with new state law. So I guess this is for you, Greg. We have no idea when the state will act on that, right? I mean, they could be tomorrow, it could be 3 years from now.
The last time I looked at it, it was a bill that was under consideration. I don't know where it is in the process, but I did hear about it late last year. But it's probably a law that would preempt our local ordinance if passed by the state. It may not be. But I think there's this gap, and we don't really know whether it's going to go through or not. And it could not make it out this session. So I think that's why the direction we got was to go forward. And then, if I might, on the 1,000 foot. Yeah, I mean, you could. That's a number that you could pick a different number.
Sorry to interrupt. That's okay. You don't need to.
Okay.
Because I got my question answered.
All right, for sure.
Okay, so let's say if this were to pass tonight, state comes along 6 months, it sort of renders this moot.
It could. It probably would. I would imagine. But if they allow for more strict regulation than what is proposed at the state level, elements of our ordinance might still be there. Yeah.
Or just.
We might have to amend it to make it comply with the state law. It depends on how they structure it. If they kind of direct us to pass an ordinance, which sometimes happens, consistent with their law, then it's more like a mandatory statewide concern law. If they just pass a uniform statewide standard and still free us to have more stringent standards, then that's the other way it might present.
Okay, so you sort of answered my question. I mean, why have it if the state passes a state law, but you said they could require us to pass ordinances. Okay, I understand that now. Thank you.
Pretty much everything we do is temporary and can be overruled by somebody. Yes. Would anybody care to make a motion or further the discussion?
I'd be happy to make a motion. Okay. Let's see. I move to introduce ordinance number
1544.
I figured it was that. An ordinance of the City Council, the City of San Carlos, amending San Carlos Municipal Code, Title 8, Health and Safety, consisting of adding a new Chapter 8.02 to the San Carlos Municipal Code to prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products in the city limits and tobacco products in pharmacies, and modifications to Chapter 8.06 to add the definition of tobacco products.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Any discussion or commentary?
Mr. Chair, there's just one change that staff's recommending is that at section 8.02.050, we change the, under enforcement, we change at subsections A and D, instead of health system chief, we say city manager in both those two places.
Is the mover and the seconder?
Is that good enough?
Okay. I heard you say earlier, or designee. Right?
Well,
yeah.
Is that? It does say designee in that, so if you just change that word, it's there.
Okay, that's okay. Yep. Motion and a second. Any discussion or comment? I have one if nobody else does. I'm going to vote in favor of this, and I'm fine with it. But I have to say that under the rubric of my comment a few minutes ago to Ron about everything we do is temporary, I do hope that at some point a future council will come back and revisit this issue just to see whether or not it's actually had an effect. The question I asked Craig about earlier, you look throughout history and many addictive substances, even much more addictive substances than tobacco, society has tried to regulate by banning them, and we certainly highly regulate access even to tobacco. The reality is, it seems to me that what really works over the long haul is really a combination of consequences for the antisocial behavior that gets induced by some of these addictive substances, coupled with education, which is sort of responding to what Mindy was talking about. It's really important that on the educational front, we keep explaining to our young people about why they really don't want to smoke. So as I said, I'm happy to support this, but there is a part of me that kind of recognizes that There are so many, many different ways of people getting access to these products that relying upon banning the sale of them alone is, to me, not a particularly wise thing to do if our goal is to try and keep people from getting addicted to them in the first place. So that's my little soapbox speech on that for tonight. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they'd like to say in reaction to that or in addition to it or whatever. If not, Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
And Councilmember Obert?
Yes. Motion passes.
Mark, could I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
The 1,000-foot rule from schools, that was not part of that ordinance, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
I believe that's correct, right, Greg?
You did not make a change to that.
I never say anything without my lawyer telling me it's okay to say. All right, so we'll move on to item 8C, consideration of adopting a resolution approving the abandonment of rights-of-way and easements policy. Just for clarification for anybody who's paying attention to tonight's benefit, this is the policy aspect of the particular item 8D that we took off the agenda, which will be dealt with at a future date, but we're still going to proceed with reviewing the policy. Actually, since I just saw Ron step out, can we, if you don't mind, Steve, we'll take a 5-minute break. What?
You just pick up and left.
Thank you, Steve.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, City Council members, Stephen Machida, Director of Public Works. So my presentation tonight is actually to talk about the abandonment policy for right-of-way and easements. So this policy is actually coming before council to determine the conditions under which city properties may be transferred from city ownership. So as we had heard, typically we don't process many abandonments here in our community. It's been a while. This is actually the first one, but I've only been here for a year. But basically, the public rights-of-ways are typically dedicated via land dedication, normally through the land development process. So they can be of streets, could be parklands, could be property for libraries, storm drain, ponds, things like that. In this case, with public streets, it's usually dedicated via land dedication via map. So it basically is property or land, either the land itself above, the airspace above, or the area below the property. And the city owns property interests, or what they call fee title. So public easements, very similar to a street right-of-way. It's usually acquired via dedication. And typically it's for construction, maintenance, it could be for utilities, or it could be for access. And the city has the privilege to use the land, however, we just don't own it. So the process of abandonment is anything considered in the public right-of-way is subject to abandonment. Rights-of-way are generally dedicated to the city for certain purposes, like, for instance, the streets, for street easement could be for various utilities access, or parkland, for instance. But sometimes easements or right-of-ways, they may diminish over time, or the need for it may diminish over time. Typically, that doesn't really happen with streets. Usually once it's street is dedicated, or property for streets is dedicated, it's usually for that intended purpose. However, if in fact either the right-of-way or easement is, we find that it has diminished, or the purpose has diminished, the city does have the ability to abandon, whether it's a street or easement. So our process for abandonment is usually it goes through this California Streets and Highways Code, the Subdivision Map Act, and the city's municipal code and/or resolutions. So currently, the abandonment policy is, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have an abandonment policy for streets right away. However, we do have a procedure to abandon public easements, and that's basically, there's one instance where I did bring before you an easement that had not been, or that had been requested to be abandoned. As I recall, it was probably dedicated to us in the 20s. There had been no use. In other words, there's no other utilities within that easement needed for those remaining years, and we found it that was really not needed for currently or in the future. So this is the reason why we're bringing this policy document to you, is so we can actually establish some type of procedure to abandon public rights-of-way, mainly property that the city owns. And basically, as I mentioned, it would provide kind of the procedures, the steps, and kind of the documents necessary that an applicant may need to submit, and the costs associated with the abandonment. And it could also actually identify certain conditions that, that council may wish to place on certain properties. And it also provides a certain amount of consistency on how we handle future abandonments. So the process of abandonments they're twofold. One is the general vacation procedures, and it's outlined in California Streets Highways Code, that section. And then a different abandonment process or vacation process, it's called the summary vacation process under a different section of the Streets and Highway Code. So the general vacation procedures, abandonment must be initiated by public hearing. The public hearing is set for 2 weeks after the public meeting. After the public hearing, council may adopt a resolution for abandonment, and then usually the approval process takes about 8 to 10 weeks, from when the package is received or it's deemed complete. Similar to a regular vacation, the summary vacation, however, is a little bit more streamlined. It doesn't really require a public hearing, but it is still need to be processed via a resolution, and it typically takes about 4 to 6 weeks before for the application is deemed complete. So I just want to point out in the policy conditions of note for in Section 8. So this is sometimes it is available, and it's something that staff thought we would include. However, it is something that, we want to probably get some direction from the city council. And one is whether, if the city council really does request, or excuse me, if the applicant is requesting to vacate a certain street, right-of-way, or in fee, would the council be comfortable actually having the applicant compensate the city for fair market value of the abandoned property? Number 2 is whether the council would consider placing future land use restrictions and or restrictions on the property to abandon, which may include lot splits. And then 3rd is whether council wishes to waive any or all portion of the compensations payable. So basically, one of the reasons why we bring this up is we just needed to have a little bit more direction, knowing that when you actually abandon parcels or property in a fee, is there a value to that property once you abandon it? So the option available is to adopt the resolution approving the rights of way, do not accept the resolution, or provide staff with a different direction. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Questions for staff? Ron.
Thank you, Mark. I'm probably going to think of others as we go along. We're kind of in uncharted territory, aren't we?
This is, yes, it's true. And that's one of the reasons why we felt it was important to bring a policy to you so that, number one, we would know how to process the applications going forward.
This is pretty much generated by the issue that we pulled from tonight's agenda.
This is one of them. However, I think we wanted to actually have some type of consistency moving forward if, in fact, we do have other street abandonments that we have received requests.
Are there model abandonment policies that other cities have?
The policy that's before you is kind of a culmination of many different policies or, sections that staff researched.
All right. So I don't remember. I read it, but on the part of someone compensating us, is it up to us to just come up with a formula, or say, we're fine, it's unusable, we're not going to charge for it? Or can we have a situation whereby if you want to do something with it, you know, lot split or whatever, then maybe we could we have the discretion to set a fee that's dependent on the planned usage of the property?
Well,
or I don't know if it's a fee or what.
Right.
Well, you have under the general abandonment statute, you can the legislative body, the council, can condition the abandonment pretty much broadly on anything you want to condition it on. So that could include compensation, that could include other restrictions. The summary abandonment, we have less discretion because there's a statutory scheme that there's not supposed to be anything in such an abandonment, so it doesn't have as much discretion. But general abandonment, you have a lot of discretion, and you do not have to grant them. I mean, it's not a property right that anyone has. It's totally discretionary on the council's part.
So we have the right to say no.
You have the right to say no or condition it with any conditions you deem appropriate.
Seems rather arbitrary.
Well, I mean, I think it's because it's a piece of public property or public's use of property for right-of-way purposes. I think the statute itself recognizes the rights of the public generally, so that's why it has. In the past, we have not asked for compensation. I think that's one of the driving forces of having a policy, because we haven't asked for compensation, and we have in the past granted abandonments of portions of right-of-way that we knew weren't going to be used, right. And then we would reserve it just for public utilities. We'd reserve that, and it had the effect of increasing the size of people's lots. And then we stopped doing that. I forget how long ago, but 8 or 9 years ago, we stopped doing that.
Well, I'm curious to see what my colleagues think.
Laura.
Yeah, so I should turn off my light because Ron asked the question I had.
That's okay. Sarah.
Couple questions. What is common practice among other agencies, our neighbors, our peninsula neighbors, on the compensation portion?
I think it really does vary, and it's certainly up to kind of the legislative bodies whether they used to. You know, I have had some instances where, you know, like we have done in the past practice where you didn't require compensation, and a lot of it will be dependent upon you know, maybe perhaps the size of the lot. So say, for instance, if you have a small sliver of right-of-way that really is not usable for any type of the street, it has no really value to the street itself or to the community. In those cases, it may not make sense to actually request compensation. Whereas if it's a fairly large parcel that needs to be abandoned or it's not really being used, that may have a different perspective.
So are we being requested tonight to have a blanket policy of requiring compensation, or can we decide that on a case-by-case basis, as you mentioned?
Just to jump in here, the draft policy actually says the council can request, you know, that we go through a process where we would be paid for the land, but it's not a requirement.
So it would be specific to each case. Right. Okay, great, thank you.
I had some questions before we get into a discussion. And actually, I realized, Greg, this has got to be one of your biggest nights. I think about 90% of the questions are going to you.
You're making me a star tonight.
It's too bad you don't get paid by the question. I've always been a little unclear about the difference between an easement and a right-of-way and a property right. Now, it sounds to me like an easement is somebody else owns the property, but the public has the ability to come in and say, hey, look, we have to put a sewer line here. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you don't want a sewer line on your property, we have a right to do that.
There are generally easement it's a right to use somebody else's property for a specified purpose.
But it's
public utilities,
somebody else's
property.
And a right-of-way is the city or some agency actually owns the property. Is that correct?
That's generally the case. It's either ownership or it's a form of easement that is a very strong easement tantamount to ownership.
Oh, I see. So they're essentially kind of a spectrum with ownership on one end and easement on the other, and there's places in between where right-of-way might be close enough sort of de facto to be ownership. Okay. Now, the other question I had is, and just to pick on using the sewer line easement thing, that presumably is of no value in private hands, right? In other words, if it's not something it would make any sense to sell, because if we sold it, like there's a sewer line on the back of my property, but let's assume there was no line there and there was just an easement. If the city were to sell it to me and I paid the money for it, I can't do anything with it because I'm not a sewer agency. I can't like put a sewer line in there.
Right. I think it gets complicated sometimes, but if it was a substantially sized easement that there's a public utilities easement on your property, you know, it might increase the utility of your lot, and therefore you could possibly, it might add some value to your lot if
okay, so to make drive my silly example further, in fact, because of the easement on my lot where there is a sewer line in the back, that's where the sewer line for my neighborhood goes. But let's assume there wasn't. One of the conditions that I had to agree to when I got my plans for my home approved was I put a fence up and some landscaping. And the deal basically is the city can come in at any time and say, sorry, we're tearing your fence down because we have to repair the sewer line. Okay.
Right.
And so that could be, you know, one could imagine if that easement affected my entire backyard, that actually might be valuable to me.
That's right. So
and it would increase the value of my property if I said, hey, you don't have to worry about your stuff being torn up. Good.
Yeah, an example would be sometimes easements can be relocated on a lot to a more advantageous place. So you actually would be abandoning part of the easement and relocating it.
Right.
Another scenario would be, and I've seen this in my practice before, where for some reason the original subdivider put a 20-foot wide easement for utilities. Well, you don't need 20 feet, so you might abandon half of it.
Right. But the point is, contrary to what I said earlier, buying and acquiring an easement actually can be valuable. It could increase the value of your property.
Yes.
Okay. That complicates what I was going to say later a little bit, but that's okay. Any other questions at this point?
Yeah, one for the moment. I'm looking at this, I guess this is a draft abandonment policy.
Yes.
And it says under number 1, initiation of procedure, a summary abandonment must be approved by City Council resolution, but does not require a noticed public hearing. City Council previews usually takes 4 to 6 weeks, blah, 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 blah. I don't know, I guess that bothers me. Obviously, if we wanted to, we could change that and say subject to a public hearing, correct?
Actually, if I may add to that as well, how does the city council take action without agendizing it? That's not, I don't see how that's possible.
Yeah, I think the distinction here is on the summary abandonment, it has to be on your agenda as a business item, and in order to enact or adopt the resolution. There's a more structural statutory provision for notice, 15-day. There's 15-day notice for a general abandonment publication. There's a lot more requirements for that. And summary abandonment is, you know, one of these abandonment where there's nothing in it. It hasn't been used for more than 5 years, and there's no plans that it's going to be used. So that's why it's an easier process.
Well, I'm trying to imagine that wording in a policy being applied to something like the Manzanita Lane issue.
Well, you couldn't use summary for that. You could not use summary because there's a public utility actually in the easement being used by the city, so you could not use the summary abandonment for that particular application.
So the city could, obviously, it would be almost on a case-by-case basis that the city would decide, you know, maybe this particular case needs a public hearing and the next case doesn't. What do you, I'm sorry, you were
I was just saying that I was corrected by the city manager that just to correct the hypothetical, the Manzanita, it's not an easement, it's a right of way, but it has utilities in it, so you can't abandon that.
If I said easement, I didn't. I meant right of way. I mean, we're all talking about a right of way abandonment policy. So, but where I was going was, would it be at staff's discretion that, you know, property A is subject to a summary, summary abandonment, and property B is not?
Well, there's probably some element of discretion, but state law still governs how we can do an abandonment. So if it doesn't qualify for a summary abandonment, we can't use that method at all.
May I jump in here just for a second? I mean, if I understand Your Honor, the issue you're raising, would you potentially be more comfortable if Greg?
More intense, yeah.
Greg,
I apologize. I just had a question here.
Would you potentially be more comfortable if we did something in the policy that basically said we will follow what I will call the more stringent rules on everything? I mean, we could probably choose to bind ourselves that way.
I think you could. I think you could.
I mean, if that makes you feel better, it's like, okay, there's not going to be any question of a lack of transparency. And, okay, why did somebody do the short version on this property and the long version on this property? We just do the long version on everything.
Right, and I suppose if it was pretty cut and dried, could be a consent item, right?
Oh, it has to be a public hearing on the
It has to be a
it has to be a
public hearing.
formal
Okay.
notice public hearing where you open and close the public hearing.
But I've been on the council for over 7 years, the first time I've ever seen this type of thing come our way, correct?
On the other hand, remember that, I mean, unless something really, really bad happens, property values are going to go nowhere but up. And the more valuable land gets, the more concern the public might have that, like, wait a minute, what happened? So that's an argument to actually, that's where I thought you were going. It's an argument to be really careful. And it happens so infrequently. So what if we spend an extra week or two or a meeting or two going through it? It's like, so what? We'll just feel better because we're being really transparent.
Part of my uncomfortableness with this is that because it's so uncharted, I feel like I'm a little adrift, that I don't have any real guidelines on how to, you know, set this policy, whether to charge or not. If we charge, how much, you know, how much do we charge? I don't know how anybody else feels, but I just feel a little bit uncertain about proceeding with a policy that I don't think I have enough information to feel good about.
Well, it's funny you say that. Two things. One is I'll pass an observation on to you. When I used to do budgets for companies, and there always comes a time when you're preparing a budget for a multinational company. It's usually about 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 days before the board presentation, when the staff is really tired and they ask a very obscure question. They're like, oh my God, this is inconsistent. And to which my answer always was, is anybody going to actually ask that question? And the answer is, no, I'm about 5 levels down. And I said, take your best guess and just go with that, okay? But the other thing is, and I see, Laura, you have your light on, and I'll come back to you in a second. I actually have spent a lot of time talking to Jeff about this, and the issue of compensation for property is, in fact, the one element of the policy that I have concerns about, and I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But over to Laura, since I think you have a question.
Thank you. Well, so I think, I guess for me, at the root of it, it is kind of around the fact that the city has an asset, right? And to abandon it, you know, without any kind of compensation, I think would be a concern. And it sounds like Sarah raised that issue as well. I think I guess the answer for me would, it sort of depends, right? So if it's something that we could handle on a case-by-case basis, which it sounds like we can, then I think that would be a prudent thing to do. And it sounds like, if I recall from the reading of this, that any fees that we incur, is that the city incurs, as well as doing all the paperwork and that type of thing, would be handled or covered by the person who's then acquiring the land, right? So there's two pieces to it. One is staff time to process this, and then the second piece would be fair market value. And it sounds like, for the most part, a lot of these areas are not high-value areas, but there could be, right? So that's correct, right, but just generally speaking. So because my understanding is when I talked to Jeff earlier in the day, you talked about the fact that we've done this in the past, but they've usually been obscure pieces and they're very small. But in cases where it's a larger piece of land where somebody could actually build on or add additional value, maybe that's the area that people are having some concern with. And it sounds like we do have some leeway, right, within the policy to address that. So.
Let me, if my colleagues will indulge me a little bit, I apologize. I was going to try and draft up a slide to do this, but I didn't have time for this afternoon, so I'll try and do this verbally. It sounds like we all have an issue about giving away public property without adequate compensation. Not in the case of trivial slivers of land, which arguably to nobody actually have a significant amount of value, but just in general. And that was the one part of the proposed policy that I had the biggest issue with, and I spent some time talking to Jeff about. My feeling is, and by the way, we have time to give guidance to staff here because we pulled the other item, which was going to be the first application of this policy, so we can actually give guidance to staff to come back and revise the policy and bring it back to us before we're actually going to use it. My thought was that first off, we ought to make the default requirement that everything, anytime we abandon property, meaning a right-of-way or actual property, that the default option is that we auction it, that it's basically open to anybody in the public who wants to bid on it, with the caveat that the council could make its own determination that, no, that's a sliver of land, we're not going to go through the auction process. So rather than having the option of requiring compensation, what we do instead is saying that the default is we want compensation, but we have the option of waiving it in a particular situation. Building on that, Jeff pointed out to me that you take, for example, the Manzanita situation. One of the issues is it does cost money to get a piece of property structured properly so that you can auction it. If nothing else, you actually oftentimes have to go out and get it surveyed. You have to pay somebody to survey it so you know exactly what it is that you're selling. And so the idea that we came up with kicking it around was that anybody who approached the city asking that we abandon a property, we would say, okay, if you want to follow that route, one of the things you're going to have to do is you are going to have to pay for those costs associated with getting the property ready to go for auction. Now, when it's up for bid and you make a bid, your bid will automatically include the amount of money that you've had to pay in order to get the property ready for auction. So if that's $3,000 and to get it ready, and you bid $500, your real bid is $3,500. And so if somebody only bid $3,000, you would be the winner. So you wouldn't have to put out yet more money on top of the upfront money that you paid. That's to avoid sort of double dipping against a local resident. And then the other little tweak that we came up with is that if the person who asks that the property be abandoned is not the winning bidder, so in my example, they paid $3,000 to get the auction process set up, they bid $500, but somebody else bid $4,000 and outbid their $3,500, that our policy would require us, to the extent that we got the $4,000, we would reimburse them for the $3,000 they paid to get the property put up for auction. And what we were trying to balance is the notion of we don't want the city to be on the hook for having to pay money to sell property to somebody, which we were perfectly fine having it sit in our inventory and not abandoned, which is fine. So we don't want to have to spend real community money to sell something, but we also want to try and make it fair that if the person who's asking to have us abandon the property doesn't actually get the property, that to the extent possible, they're not harmed financially either. I realize that's a little bit kind of complicated, but it was sort of the thinking that we came up with when we crossed Jeff's concern about not wanting to force the city to spend money to auction off property with my idea of I really don't want to just give property away to people, because I just don't think that's in the community's interest. Slivers is one thing. a few thousand square feet, even if it's not big enough to build a house on, it enables you to build a bigger house under our rules. And that's a valuable thing. And the community should be compensated for that, because the community is the entity that owns the land. So if that makes any sense, that was what I was thinking.
It does. Steve, how many properties do we have that are potentially subject to this policy? Do we know? I didn't.
I wouldn't even hazard a guess. I mean, because presumably most of the time whenever we do receive a street dedication, it does become either a street at some point. In this case with Manzanita, it was a lane that was actually dedicated. However, at the time in 1912, the Board of Supervisors did not accept it. So it just was
sat there.
Yeah.
All right. But basically, we're talking maybe just a few paper roads in town.
It's very, yes, I would imagine it would be just a very few number of paper roads.
But if I can interject just for a second, theoretically it could be, and it's just theoretical, it could be more than that. It's basically any property that the city owns. So for example, even the North Crestview Park, which admittedly is constrained by a plebiscite would have to be, but that is city property. And if there ever was a plebiscite and the community said, yeah, feel free to go ahead and sell it, that would also be something that we could, somebody could say, well, why don't you abandon it? You're not doing anything there. I also remember talking to Omar years ago that there was some discussion during the restructuring phase about consolidating corporation yards with some neighboring jurisdiction. If that had happened, all of a sudden you have potentially abandonable property where your corporate used to be. So I'm not disagreeing with Steve that the stuff on paper is actually relatively small, but there are other things where it could potentially apply.
Yeah, but I wasn't really talking about that. I was just talking about these little slivers, paper roads and abandoned lanes and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just to kind of add to the discussion of kind of what and clarify, there is a difference between the Streets and Highways Code abandonment policy that we're talking about tonight and disposal of public property that has different rules. Surplus property, sometimes it's surplus, sometimes it's just property that you have. And then the scope of this policy is actually, I think, broader than paper streets that are left over and not being used. It's probably almost every street in town that you see the paved used right-of-way. There's remnant right-of-way in almost every street in town, because the dedication from the subdivider probably had a 40-foot wide or a 50-foot wide right-of-way, but the street's only 30 feet wide. So there's always a little bit of extra that sometimes, and it depends on the side of the street that you're on. Sometimes it's wider on one side because the subdivider didn't precisely put the right-of-way in the exact center of the easement. So it varies by location. My house, I think I've got about 5 feet of public right-of-way that sort of seems like my front yard, but it's not, right? So that applies everywhere in the city. There's situations like that. So,
like, actually, as you were talking there, I mean, the Holly Street corridor would be an example of that too.
Another example, the right-of-way is much wider than what's built on. So,
I guess the question at this point is further discussion, further questions. I sort of proposed, admittedly, a rather lengthy tweak / set of directions to staff about coming back with a revised policy. We can also adopt what's here in front of us. We can tweak it in other ways. We can choose to just end our discussion and bring this back at some future date. What's the council's pleasure?
I think your idea is really creative, Mark. I just wonder if in each circumstance, would it be most beneficial for the neighbor to acquire the land and care for it and treat it as his or her own property versus having a third party come in and leave it wild? And if we auction it, are we, kind of opening it up to, I don't know, not being cared for by a third party versus a person a resident and, who comes to us and would care for it better? It's
funny you say that. The one thing I didn't mention that I was sort of wrestling with is we are creating potentially, anytime you sell one of these properties, it's nice to talk about auctioning, but it really may be a very, very small pool of potential buyers. Theoretically, it could even be one, depending on the geometry. There's only one person who would have a rational interest in buying this, in which case you wouldn't get very much compensation for it. But on the other hand, while it's what I outlined, it's certainly theoretically possible that, like in the case of the Manzanita property, which is, I think, about 3/4 of a mile away from my house, I could bid on it under the system I proposed. But I doubt I would do that, because there'd be little, the only reason economically to do that would be if I thought somehow I could get the guy who really wants to own it to have to pay more money. And if that's the case, and he thought that, he'd just offer a higher bid to the city. So
I've got a question for Jeff. Let's assume we go with Mark's idea about this auction process. What's the impact on the staff? I realize that, you know, people would pay for it, homeowners would pay for it. What sort of impact is there on staff time and preparation and that sort of thing?
I think these things are so rare that it would not be measurable.
So we wouldn't, it's not something we'd need to be too concerned about.
That's correct. I mean, I think maybe from a high level, and I do very much agree with Councilmember Olbert's comments that we don't need to get an answer tonight the way things worked out. We can kind of treat this item as a study session and just sort of get everybody's feedback. I think if we back up a little bit and just think from a policy perspective, you know, what are the things that we're trying to accomplish when we release a property? There might be a few different things, right? Let's say we've got this steep hillside and it's just costing us a fortune to maintain. We don't use it for anything. It really serves no purpose to the public interest. It's not ever going to be part of a trail connection or any of those kinds of things. And we're spending money maintaining it. There would be a public interest to actually not be spending that money to maintain it. If we're going to be in a position where, like the case on Manzanita, where we're being approached to essentially get rid of a piece of property, I would think that, you know, from my perspective, it would be a priority for us not to incur expense on behalf of the public entertaining this third-party request. And then you get into some more interesting, you know, aspects beyond just the money, which I think Sarah was starting to allude to, where you could have, you know, there are people out there who've sort of made a living going around and buying public land that's on auction. They don't even see it. They buy it for a few bucks and hope that they hit the jackpot and got lucky, and occasionally they do. So you might have some of those interests where they're not maintaining it, they're not really part of the community, it just kind of disappeared off into some private trust for some time. And then you could also foresee sort of the bad behavior. You don't get along with your neighbor situations, and they're rare, fortunately, in this community, but they do happen. You want the property, your neighbor just wants to really annoy you. You know, maybe just get out there with the lawnmower and just run it 24/7 or whatever. That really probably wouldn't serve the community well either. And then my big issue when this came forward, it was clear to me that this kind of fit the model of a lot split. You know, I think of it as kind of like the Reese's peanut butter cup, right? You know, somebody else owns a valuable property already. We own this thing that's really probably on the market not very valuable, but if you put them together, you've created a whole lot of new value. And it would seem to me that if we were going to be doing that, we would probably want to protect the public's interest and say, well, you know, while on its own it's not valuable, our little piece of peanut butter here, when you put it together with your chocolate, all of a sudden you've got something that's worth twice as much as your property alone. And wanting to see, you know, how the council felt about that, because that's a kind of a different scenario, right? But we did last year hear from the council and the community pretty extensively that lot splits weren't desirable. We heard some of that earlier this evening in public comment, but they can be very valuable. So we're looking for that kind of direction from the council to help us sort of inform folks and in our own way to process, if that's at all helpful.
That is helpful, because I started thinking of all kinds of scenarios where you could have, like the people who are here tonight, they get into a bidding war with the guy that wants to buy it because they think he's going to add on. But then again, I realized that one of the things that we were going to put in this policy, or I don't know, maybe it's a resolution that would control what they could do with the property. In other words, in this particular situation, you could say, well, yeah, you can get the land, but if you're thinking of adding onto your house, building on unstable property, that land has to, by deed restriction, cannot be developed in the future. I guess maybe that's our ultimate stick in the process. Do I understand that correctly?
That would be one of that's in the category of a condition of approval that you could put on an abandonment. Right. And I we want to talk high level about a policy as opposed to specific properties if we can. But I think that's a condition that you could impose, and the idea of the valuation. I guess I've been hearing two different ways of valuing it. One is, well, get an appraisal and what's the strip worth, and the other is, well, what's the strip worth to you as the person who's acquiring it? How much does it add to the value of your property? Those are two ways to look at the value. And then auctioning is the third potential way. Market.
Good discussion, and I have some things I want to continue, but Laura reminded me a minute ago that I did not actually ask if there was any public comment on this item. Anybody? Tara, if you'd like to make public comment, please fill out a card. Okay. Okay. Jeff and I also talked about things like the lot split stuff. Clearly the council, like any property owner in this case, because we're representing the community as a property owner, has the ability to put restrictions on the land that they're selling. Personally, I'm actually not in favor of doing that on a case-by-case basis. And the reason is because, for example, like lot splits, we have rules in place that govern lot splits. And if the council doesn't want any lot to ever be split in San Carlos, we could probably adopt a regulation that would make it impossible for any lot to, maybe we could even just outright declare you cannot split lots. I don't know if that's possible, but maybe it is. And so doing it on a case-by-case basis to me is in fact somehow like unfair to people. It's like one set of rules for everybody. If we need to make exceptions, then adjust the rules so they reflect objective factors like slope or what have you. And similarly, I actually had a discussion with Betty before the meeting started about her concerns about damage to her property from if somebody were to build on this combined lot, if Rick Bradley were able to buy it. My understanding is, and Steve can probably correct this if I'm wrong, my understanding is if somebody wants to build anything on land in San Carlos, we won't let them. We have rules that govern, you can't build on things that are going to cause damage to other people's property, right?
That is correct.
That's part of the permit review process. I know like Chilton Park up near where I used to live was part of a developer's property, but it did not get developed because it's got a land slip on it, and it just was not economic for them to try and fix it, so they gave it to the city and it turned into a park. But we have those rules in place too. So I'm kind of like, if we've got a problem with the way our rules work, let's change the rules. If the rules are okay, let's not put additional special rules on this individual transaction.
Well, I guess the question then at hand, though, is does this policy as written solve the issue? Or do we want to send it back and have it revised more?
It does not for me, actually, for the simple reason that it says the default case is we don't seek compensation. The council can ask to do that, but that's not the default case. And I personally would be a lot more comfortable, whether you use my idea or something else, I would be a lot more comfortable with the idea of saying that it's the other way around, that whenever we abandon a right-of-way or property, we expect somehow to get compensated for it because we want the community to get something for what it's giving up. And it's an exception that the council can grant, saying, no, in this particular case, we're just going to give it away for free.
Right. So, for example, in number 8 here of this proposed policy, it says, City Council may consider as a condition of approval, applicant be required to pay fair market value. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
So we might want to take that part out and say the applicant will pay fair market value, or some other arrangement of words that satisfies that concern.
That's right. And leave, because the council does have the authority to waive that. I mean, we can't bind ourselves that way. Okay. So I would just recognize that. And in fairness, I will admit that what I'm saying in changing the language is really more a statement of intent. Because if you allow the exception either way, well, then we could use the existing proposed language and just every time say, nope, we want to sell that. We want to sell that. We want to sell that.
So I think my feeling on this, I keep kind of thinking about if the reverse were true, right? If we were acquiring land, we're required to pay fair market value, right, through eminent domain. And I do think it would be a case by case basis. Stephen, you hesitated answering the question about how many plots of land does the city own throughout San Carlos, right? And I would imagine that everything that's owned by the city of San Carlos is, a lot of different configurations and in different locations. And so I think guiding principles around this are probably more appropriate than trying to put a set of rules in place that would address every conceivable potential for abandonment. And I think the idea that, we have the ability to look at how the land is zoned, right, because the city makes those rules, and come up with a potential fair market value price based on that zone, right? So I guess from my perspective, I feel like trying to keep this simpler with guiding principles would make the most sense than trying to create some sort of a document that articulates what would happen in every potential scenario. That makes sense.
So if we treat this as I think what it's properly evolved into as kind of a study session giving guidance to staff, to be fair to staff, what if any guidance are we giving them?
I would say the first thing I think we should decide is the whole issue of compensation. Are we going to charge somebody? What are we going to charge? So that whole sentence about, where is it? It was in the actual policy itself, and I'm sorry I went away from it.
It's item 11, I believe.
Number 8, right? There it is. I would like to see that worded that gives us, that sends that communicates the city's intention to the public that we are going to seek, for lack of a better term, fair market value compensation. I think that's probably, from what I'm hearing, that's got to be in there. And then that we also have the ability to place restrictions and conditions on the sale of the property as well. I mean, this Manzanita Lane is a perfect example. But I mean, maybe in the planning process, maybe that's unnecessary, Greg? Is it unnecessary? Because the planning process already says, well, you want to build there, but you can't because the land's too steep. So do we need to put that in there?
Yeah, that would be this policy wouldn't override our code. So, I mean, I think that's the simplest way to say it.
So that's one change that sticks out to me.
I would be fine. I mean, I accept that direction to staff too.
I do too.
You do too. I actually had a question I wanted to ask Greg based on the conversation Sarah and I were having a few minutes ago. Is it possible for us, do we have the statutory authority to restrict the people who can, if we were to try and sell property, auction it, whatever, do we have the statutory authority to restrict the potential bidders to people who own property adjacent to the property that's there, or are residents of San Carlos? Or is it by operation of law, it has to be available to anybody who can buy stuff?
I think, my first thought is you can do that because you have discretion over the process for an abandonment. You have a lot of discretion to condition it, and it's just a matter of setting up some rules about how you're going to conduct such a sale. If you're trying to develop competition, of which that's what auctions generally do to bid up the purchase price, you just want to have procedures that establish how you're going to conduct the auction.
In that case, I would like to see if anybody else supports this. I would like to ask that staff research how we provide that flexibility in the policy. I'm not saying, personally, I think in most cases, I would personally not opt to do that, but I do think Sarah and Jeff were raising a valid concern, and I could see a council wanting to say, we don't want out-of-town people who are just sort of speculating on this stuff doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of the case from last year where in St. Francis Wood, somebody bought at an auction the entire street of this homeowner's area, and that was their plan to sell back to they bought it at a tax sale, and the Board of Supervisors overruled the tax sale, and so the neighborhood got their property back. But I mean, people do that. I mean, when they go out there.
I had forgotten that. So, I mean, I'd like to see that element in there, even though, as I said, I personally probably most times would not choose to activate it. So,
You don't want to see, I'm confused.
I want to make sure that the council has, and it's spelled out in the policy, that we sort of reserve the right to
refuse sale?
Well, not only to refuse sales, but to restrict who the bidders are. Okay. And just, see if that's possible. I'm trying to react to what Sarah and Jeff were saying.
Okay.
Any other comments to give staff? Staff, do you understand what we're talking about?
I think so. Cost recovery, fair market value are going to be important, and then we will sort of get into some guiding principles in terms of the type of information that the council would be interested in receiving as these come forward to you on a case-by-case basis. Those guiding principles will help inform the applicant and the staff on what information to gather, and then we'll look into the issue that you just raised about limiting sale for other public-type interest purposes.
Or if you come up with some other way of addressing the issue that you and Sarah were talking about. I think there's a general sense we'd like to have some tools to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I thought you were going to say you wanted to limit the sale to non-smokers.
Only if it's a flavored tobacco.
Right, only if you ever smoke flavored tobacco, you cannot bid on this property.
All right.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
To my colleagues, we have 2 more items plus reflections, reports on subcommittees and whatnot. It's 10 after 10. We've talked before about we want to not wait till the last second. My gut tells me that we're probably going to run at least a little bit past 10:30. Would somebody be willing to make a motion to extend the meeting to personally till 11 o'clock, with the goal being that we try and get done as early as we can?
I don't have a problem making that motion, but I want to ask, do we need to deal with the parking subcommittee tonight?
I believe we can table, the council can choose to table or continue any item on the agenda. Is that correct, Greg? Jeff?
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of urgency to either of the remaining items if you're running out of steam.
Would you like to table both items? No, I meant Ron, sorry.
Oh, no, I mean, well, I guess the question is this sidewalk vendor thing, you think it's going to take more than 40 minutes? Is it when I read it, I thought, this doesn't look all that complicated, but that was me.
If you'd like to make a motion for 10:45, that's fine with me too. I tend to round to half-hour intervals.
I'll make a motion that we extend the meeting to 11 and with the full hope that we're done by 10:30.
Here, you can wrap me with the gavel if it's not done that time. Is there a second?
Second.
Greg, can we just do this by acclamation? Or do we have to do roll call?
Yeah, this one does not need a roll call. So
all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? So moved. Thank you. So item 8E, consideration of introducing an ordinance establishing a sidewalk vendor program, amending the San Carlos Municipal Code to add Chapter 5.43 and amending Chapter 5.44, solicitation definitions, deleting Chapters 5.60 and 10.32.300, amending Chapter 12.12.120, regulation of park facilities, and making findings pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act.
Well, I think this is my item. So in looking at it, I'm just going to start by saying that there's a slight typo in that title you just read. 12.12.120 should be 12.12.210, and in the body of the ordinance, it has the correct section number. I don't know, it's a transposition or something on a keystroke. I don't know how it happened, but I'll just go through the ordinance and what it's for. Last year in September, the state passed a bill dealing with sidewalk vendors, and it's a statewide mandatory program. Cities can enact their own ordinances, and but there's all other ordinances that we might have are not valid any longer. So this is one of those cases where it's a state mandate, and all the ordinances that we have that affect sidewalk vendors are no longer valid. So in order to be able to enforce and have reasonable regulation of sidewalk vendors, we need to adopt our own new compliant ordinance. This is modeled after several other cities in my research that acted right away, and most of them are in Southern California. For some reason, there was a lot of enforcement there over the past several years that led to some really sad stories about how people who were low-income people, immigrants, who were just had these little sidewalk carts, and cities were heavy-handedly enforcing their codes, some of which were like 50 years old, and people were put in jail because they couldn't they didn't have the resources to fight. So state law now has taken over and decriminalized sidewalk vendors. There's no way to have any kind of criminal code enforcement against a sidewalk vendor. There's two categories of sidewalk vendor. There's the stationary sidewalk vendor and the mobile sidewalk vendor. You have more discretion on stationary sidewalk vendors. You can ban them from residential neighborhoods, which this proposed ordinance does. But the mobile sidewalk vendors, the type that you see sometimes selling different products in a cart, can operate anywhere on your sidewalks in your city. Where we have some discretion is in the rest of the public right-of-way, how long they can be, how close they are to other sensitive uses or inconsistent or incompatible uses. If you have in your parks, if you have a vendor or a special event or a farmer's market, those are areas where we can regulate and keep the vendors out while those temporary events are going on. So, for example, the farmer's market here in San Carlos, the sidewalk vendors would not be allowed to be there when we have the farmer's market going on. So to shorten this, because of the late hour, I'm open to any questions you have about the ordinance and what we are intending to accomplish with it. But the bottom line is it's a ordinance to comply with the new state law and to recognize that now sidewalk vendors can operate in our city without a criminal violation. It's only administrative violations. But we still have a permit requirement. We still have distance requirements, so it's a pretty robust ordinance in that respect.
Thank you, Greg. Laura?
Thank you. So as I was reading through this and some of the distance from requirements, it made me think of some of the events that we have in town throughout the year. And I was just wondering, so for example, music in the park or hometown days where we have food trucks lined up on Cedar Street adjacent to Burton Park, I would expect that this might impact that. And I know, for example, we have planning going on right now. So again, and will there be some sort of a phase-in period to notify some of the volunteer groups that put these things on so that they understand what the new regs are and all that type of thing?
Well, we can't, I mean, the main thing is we can't enforce our current ordinance that is inconsistent with state law. So we could have a phase-in period. It's just, if we have a phase-in period, we've got we can't enforce the old, so we have to have something in place. But we could definitely have flexibility in, in how we try and deal with the events. But yeah, if a food vendor is on the sidewalk around Burton Park, unless the whole park is set aside in an encroachment permit setting, we might not be able to restrict them from the sidewalks. In the park, we have more discretion in the park itself, but on the sidewalks around the park, it might be harder to do the enforcement.
Well, what I'm getting at, Greg, is more around making sure that as people are organizing events where in the past we've had vendors, right, that block the sidewalk, are we going to have some way of notifying them so that they can start that planning process, I guess is what I'm kind of getting at. So even some of our own events that we do through Parks and Rec, right, the food trucks line up and it blocks the sidewalk. And as I read through this, you're not allowed to block a sidewalk from people getting through, right? Mm-hmm. So.
Oh, I see. You're about current, food trucks and current vendors that are involved in the event. Yeah, we definitely would want to have an education campaign. I think that makes sense to inform people what the new rules are. And if they already, I don't think, can block a sidewalk. I mean, they may be, by the way it's just been done that way, but. I've seen food trucks at Burton Park and they're lining in the street, which is a different thing than this. So the food trucks in the street would be they're in the public right of way, not on the sidewalk. So they're not actually a sidewalk vendor, but a sidewalk vendor hypothetically on the sidewalk right next to a food truck. Some of the distance requirements are intended to prevent that kind of congregation of different vendors.
Ron.
Yeah, I just had a quick one. I assume by vendor we mean someone who's actually selling something and
yes.
Not a person distributing literature on the sidewalk.
That's different. Yeah, that's the solicitation, or there's nonprofit solicitors and commercial solicitors. That's another section of the code.
Does that include distributors of political or of literature of a political nature?
Yeah, we don't regulate that because it's free speech.
Free speech. All right. And we don't regulate where on the sidewalk they can set up?
You mean the food vendors or?
No, food vendors and anybody distributing literature. Are the rules pretty much the same as to where on the sidewalk? In other words, if the food vendors can obstruct
they can't obstruct. Neither one can obstruct the sidewalk. Yes. So
that's what I thought. Okay. Thanks.
Sarah.
Thank you. I was trying to think of examples in town of people who sell things specifically on the sidewalk, and the only real groups that I can think of are my favorite Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts that sell cookies and popcorn. So how does this affect them and me?
Well, in some ways, it's actually an improvement for those types of vendors, because there is a stationary vendor part of the ordinance, and so they would be considered a stationary vendor.
So they would have to pick up a permit from the city?
I mean, that's what the state law requires, but it's not an onerous process that's contemplated.
Okay. And is this a top priority for enforcement in our city?
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you.
I had a quick question. I'm not sure if this is either a Greg or a Jeff question, but do we have any sense of what the motivation was, or the political forces in play that caused the state to do this? Were they reacting to lawsuits that had been filed? Was it a special interest group that got everybody's attention? I mean, I know it doesn't matter because we have to comply with it anyway. I just like to understand.
No, there was definitely some communities in Southern California had like a zero tolerance for sidewalk vendors. So I'm probably paraphrasing what happened, but a sidewalk vendor is traveling from city A that was more permissive, and then they just kind of cross the street and they're in city B, and you really can't tell what's down in Southern California. You're not sure which city you're in. And Los Angeles had a really robust ordinance that made it very difficult to be a sidewalk vendor, and then other cities didn't regulate at all. So people were getting caught in code enforcement misdemeanor violations, and then they didn't have the ability to pay, and then they'd get more and more trouble, and it was like a vicious cycle for people who had all they were doing was selling products on their cart to make a living. So the state saw some of those stories and said, we're not going to allow this anymore, and liberalized the situation.
So that sounds to me like it was of which there are other examples, some municipalities overreaching what the larger polity felt was beyond the bounds of fairness, and then they came in and said, fine, we're changing the rules.
And that's why there's no criminal violation possible under the new regulations. It's just administrative citations.
Got it. Would anybody like to make public comment on this? Seeing none, is there anybody on the dais who'd like to make a motion or continued discussion?
I'll make a motion.
Remembering, please, the typographical error. It's 210, not 120.
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
Second
210.
to last
Got
line.
it. Okay. I move to introduce ordinance number
1545.
1545, an ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos establishing a sidewalk vendor program, amending the San Carlos Municipal Code to add Chapter 5.43 and amending Chapter 5.44, solicitation definition, deleting Chapters 5.60 and 10.32.300, amending Chapter 12.12.210, regulation of park facilities, and making findings pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
And Councilmember Obert?
Yes. Motion passes, which brings us to 8F, consideration of appointing representatives to the Ad Hoc Parking Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The staff recently, discussing some issues that we wanted to begin to bring forward to the council related to parking, discovered that we didn't currently have a parking subcommittee, and remembered that sort of by design the council had wanted to create some subject areas around that were geographical in nature rather than topical. And I know sort of our default was that, well, most of the parking issues that we deal with are in the downtown. So should we just go to the downtown subcommittee, which is Adam and Laura, with this issue, even though the parking issue that in question isn't in the downtown? And so we kind of felt a little bit stuck and thought we would come back and talk to the council about who we should approach to, rather than just kind of cherry picking two of you who we'd want to deal with this. Earlier today, I think a great idea was raised to me, which is, rather than create a new subcommittee, just simply add parking anywhere in the city to the downtown subcommittee. So it will be downtown issues and any other parking issues we don't expect this to, result in a lot more subcommittee meetings or anything for those two, but it will give us some direction on where we're supposed to go for some guidance and help on some of these issues.
Comments, questions?
Well, I guess that if it becomes a different motion to absorb the parking subcommittee into the downtown committee, correct? Because this says appoint council members to the ad hoc parking committee, or can we just appoint the same two people?
I think what we could do is does it actually have to be, it has to be moved and voted on, but could we to use your idea, could we make a motion to subsume the duties of the parking subcommittee into the downtown committee and rename it the Downtown and Parking Subcommittee?
Yeah, I think with that guidance, if the council was just, literally, if we just had that guidance, then we could proceed with operationally with that. And next time the list comes forward to you, we'll simply reflect it that way.
What says the dais? Is that idea okay?
Yeah.
Well, I would just suggest, I know, Mark, you were on it previously, and if you want to remain on it, and or if there's anybody else that wants to step up to do that. What I have a lot. I'm happy with all of my assignments, so I don't feel like I need more. But
well, as heartbroken as I will be not to be approached on parking issues anymore, I think I will be able to get past my grief.
Okay, yeah.
And out of respect for everybody's time, we'll be sure to package them together so we're not creating more meetings and we're just being more efficient with your time.
So you have the guidance that you need.
Yep.
Yes.
All right, we are on to council communications and announcements, reflections and agenda setting. I actually had one item I wanted to bounce off the council, actually two, about agenda setting, but does anybody else have some to start with?
I have two things to share, but I'm happy to.
Of an agenda setting nature, or?
No, sorry,
Reflections?
reports out or whatever that part is.
We'll come to that in a second.
Okay.
Okay. So, by the way, one just quick reflection. It may have just been sort of by accident, but it seemed like we had a number of items tonight where there were a number of, the written material was X, but what we really meant was Y, glitches. So if there's ways that just sort of interrupts the flow of stuff, as you can appreciate. So if there's a way we can avoid that, that'd be great. The two agenda setting items I had, I wanted to bounce off the council. A while ago, we used to allow council members to make their reports on subcommittees and whatever other announcements they wanted to make at the beginning of meetings. We shifted it to the end of meetings, I think, because for a while there, that part of the meeting was getting to be fairly lengthy because some council members tended to speak for a long time. As you can see, the problem is that if there are things we wish to share with the community, there's no community here at this point. So the idea I had was to see whether or not the council would be willing to put an item, standing item on the agenda to allow brief comments, and perhaps we limit ourselves to the same 2 or 3 minutes that we allow public speakers to have, to make whatever brief comments we want to make in the beginning, and then if there are longer comments, we can make them at the end. So I don't know how people feel about that.
I would be in support of that because I saw what happened.
Right.
The comments just disappeared, and sometimes there were important things to report out on.
Right.
So I would not mind at all returning that to beginning of the meeting with the proviso that we all stick to a predetermined couple of minutes.
We'll use the timer and the gavel.
Sure.
Is that okay?
I think that's a great idea.
All right, good. Staff got that? Okay. The other agenda item that I wanted to mention is we talked tonight about setting a cannabis tax. As I presume my new colleagues know, San Carlos, when we adopted our regulations, banned the retail sale of cannabis products in San Carlos. My understanding is the way the state law has evolved, that means that we don't get any of the sales tax benefit of products that our residents are buying elsewhere and get delivered in San Carlos. Is that correct? So I wanted to just, because the topic was on the agenda tonight, I wanted to see whether or not there was any interest in revisiting the issue of the ban that we have on retail sales. I know, Ron, when you and I were on the former council, we had both sort of said, I think you more than me, that that was something you would be open to coming back to at some point. I don't know if we've had enough time pass, but I just wanted to bring it up. So,
yeah, I thought that if we're going to, have retail sales, or I thought we should. We thought we should allow it, and we should tax it.
Okay.
I still feel that way.
I'm supportive of bringing it back. I know this is a fairly sensitive topic potentially, so our normal rule is 2 to bring back, but if there's opposition to that, I'm happy not to, at least speaking for myself, not for Ron, I'm happy not to ask that it be brought back at this point. So what's the other side of the dais feel like?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of bringing that back.
Okay.
How much staff time would be? I feel like we just had our retreat and we have these like major things that we want to accomplish as well. Are we taking this? In my opinion, this sounds like a really big issue that might take away from the other issues that we talked about.
Yeah, normally that would be true, but because we've already done this, all we would do is change the date on the material from the last time this was presented to the council and re-present it, because nothing else has changed. So we already have, literally already have all the reports and everything.
So it would be one meeting, a study session, basically?
Yeah, you could, depending on how efficient we were, how much public input we had. I think last time we did it in 2 meetings, a study session followed by an actionable item. And like I said, that's everything's already written on it. It just would be a matter of having a vote.
And we would see all the same items that we saw the last time it was presented, the surveys and all that.
Yep.
Mark, would you mind terribly if we waited until Adam Rack came back and made this decision as a full council?
I have no problem with that. Do you have a problem with that? Fine.
Thank you.
We'll bring it back later. Actually, I had a third item to potentially agendize. If you've been following some of the recent discussion on Nextdoor and other places about the Transit Village / Trestle Apartments, there's been a recent flurry of concern and anger about some things that are going on there. Not trying to get into all of that, but one of the things that struck me was there are comments being made about, oh, the city should have done this, the council should have put this rule in place before it authorized this project, they missed this, they missed that. And one of the things I always found helpful in the private sector when we did something big for the first time, and the Transit Village was a huge project like Wheeler Plaza was, is when they get done or when they get close to being done, you sort of do an after-action review, lessons learned, so the next time you have something big, it's like, what do you remember? I wanted to see if there was an interest on the dais about asking staff to agendize that at some appropriate time, to have that kind of discussion. And the goal would be, as a study session, to give direction to staff on the next big project that comes down the line. Here are some things that we didn't think about before that we'd like thought about again. So, not hearing any support for that, so we'll let that go. All right. Council member reports on subcommittees, regional boards, commissions, and committees. Sarah, you said you had several.
I do. Well, I just have 2 things, and I'm going to be very quick. So I attended the San Mateo County Preparing for Wildfire convening a couple weeks ago. It was a very large gathering. We heard from ecology experts, fire chiefs, and elected officials from Sonoma County on wildfire preparedness strategies and lessons learned. And I thought that several of the takeaways are very valuable. I spoke with Jeff about them this morning. It underscored the need to work with the community and do a lot of outreach on evacuation strategies. And another issue that was raised that I found interesting was the amount of people who are underinsured in these wildfire areas. So when I was speaking with Jeff about it, and I know that we all got an email, but I wanted to bring it to the community's attention that we have 2 upcoming community meetings for wildfire preparedness on Saturday, April 13th and Tuesday, April 16th. And it sounds like some postcards are going to be going out to the residents, and we're going to be spreading the word. So I'm very happy with the progress on that. And then the second thing was I was approached by a council member in Redwood City about legislation that Kevin Mullen is working on in Sacramento to modernize the Brown Act. It's AB 992, which would exempt the posting, commenting, liking, interaction with, or participation in social media platforms. And it's an interesting piece of legislation, and I'm probably going to write a letter in support of that, and I wanted to pass along the little fact sheet to my colleagues here, if you're interested as well.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura.
Thank you, Chair Olbert. So a couple of meetings I attended were the county and city area government Homes for All meeting, and effectively it was all of the various cities within San Mateo County were invited to learn more about the CASA Compact, which is about a 10-point plan to address the housing crisis that we have in California, essentially. And they compared elements of the CASA Compact to pending legislation in that's coming from the state, that's being considered in the state and the assembly. And the purpose of it was to provide, for us to provide our perspective on that. And the other meeting was just the general meeting for what's CCAG, County City Area Government. I served as an alternate that, and the notable topic really was around the long-range planning for Caltrain and just how their thinking and thought process around getting ready for future state and anticipation of more people riding the train and things like that. So that was interesting to see them. It goes out to 2050. And then I took a tour of Family Connections, which is a not-for-profit organization that serves about 300 people, both parents and kids, pre through kindergarten and a little bit thereafter. And their model is very inspiring in that they provide a lot of hands-on and really creating a strong community of people who have young families to give them resources and get the kids off to and the families off to a great start. So that was very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Ron?
Thank you, Mark. All right. Thank you, Mark. Just a few things. I attended a housing roundtable meeting a couple of weeks ago. Sarah was there as well. Martin Romo from our planning staff also came. Jerry Hill hosted it, and it was all about the CASA Compact, SB 50, and it was a robust 2.5-hour discussion on all of our neighboring cities and San Mateo County's concerns about SB 50. Also, on a related note, I also met with Don Horsley, I believe last week. Tara and Jeff came along, and we also communicated our similar concerns to him as well. Just a quick note to Mark. I thought you did a great job on the State of the City address. It was
thanks.
It was wonky, but in a good way. So I enjoyed that.
I tried to hide that with the animations.
No, I can't do animation, so I was very impressed. Also went to a Samtrans retreat, board retreat last week, where we talked about a lot of things. One of the things we talked about was the potential either rehab or rebuild of the Samtrans building itself. So if that comes forward, there will be lots of opportunities for our public to participate in that discussion. And finally, just a reminder, there is a wildfire meeting. I don't know if Sarah mentioned this. A couple of community meetings coming up. April 13th will be a Saturday meeting at 10 o'clock at Domenico's. I plan on going to that. There's also one, I think, a few days later, and I don't know where that is. Was that library?
Hiller Aviation.
At Hiller, thank you. At Hiller Aviation, and what time is that, Tara?
7 p.m.
7
Tuesday,
p.m.
April 16th, 7 p.m.
I was trying to read your hieroglyphics there. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I just had one item. Actually, today I had the opportunity to do a delivery session with Meals on Wheels. Got to meet some delightful older residents of San Carlos, including one person who had just recently turned 100, and all I can say is that if I manage to live to be 100 and be in the same shape and mental faculty condition as she is, I will consider my life to have been well lived. So that was a lot of fun, and the residents seem to really enjoy it too, and I encourage my colleagues, if you have the opportunity to do that. I think, Sarah, you've done it recently. I did not have to burn the wheel tires on my car getting out of that a lot, even though we were on some hilly lots. Inside story. So with that, Jeff, does staff have any reports on city administrative business?
Nothing further than what we've reported this evening.
Okay. Well, in that case, it's time for adjournment. As is sometimes the case, the chair is going to adjourn in context of something. I want to adjourn tonight by offering condolences to the people in New Zealand who suffered a really terrible tragedy recently, as I think we all know, when a delusional madman decided that the way to build a better society was to go around and slaughter some of his neighbors as they were exercising their spiritual beliefs, which I find really repellent. And I also want to recognize the people in government of New Zealand for quickly taking action and working hard to make changes to their society to minimize the risk of that kind of thing happening again. And I hope that someday the land of the free and the home of the brave takes the similar steps. So with that, we will adjourn the meeting.